On the night of September 7th, 1940, over 300 German bombers crossed the English Channel and began dropping incendiary devices on the docks of East London. The fires they started were visible from 150 miles away. And yet, in the streets below, people were already moving, not in panic, but with the particular calm of those who had been preparing for exactly this moment for over a year. Wardens were at their posts. Families were already underground. The kettle, in more than one shelter, was already on. The blackout years were not only about bombs and sirens. They were about something quieter and in many ways more remarkable: the complete reorganization of daily life around darkness. Streets that had blazed with light for decades went silent and black overnight. People learned to navigate by feel, by memory, by the faint luminescence of a white-painted curbstone. They learned to sleep through noise, to work through fear, to find one another in the dark without a torch. Take a breath. Let your shoulders settle. Whatever is waiting for you outside this moment can wait a little longer. And if your eyes are growing heavy, let them close. There is nothing here that needs to be seen. These facts are made to be heard, to drift through the quiet like smoke from a shelter candle, slow and without urgency. That is what this collection holds. 101 facts about the blackout years, the dark streets, the warden's knock, the shelter communities, the small human ingenuities that kept ordinary life moving through the longest nights of the 20th century. Let them come to you slowly. There is no need to hold every detail. Just let the world of it settle, quietly, the way darkness does when you finally stop being afraid of it. Fact number 1. On the first night of the London Blitz, September 7th, 1940, the fires started by German bombers in the East End docks burned so intensely and so widely that pilots flying subsequent raids used the glow as a navigation beacon. From over 100 miles away, the fire services received over 900 emergency calls in a single night, a number the system had never been designed to handle. And yet, what is perhaps most remarkable about that first night is not the scale of the destruction, but the response to it. The wardens who were already at their posts before the all clear had sounded. The neighbors who emerged from shelters to help those whose homes were burning. The auxiliary fire service volunteers who had trained for this on weekend afternoons and now found themselves facing something that no weekend training had fully prepared them for. Rescue workers dug through rubble with bare hands in the dark, guided by the sound of voices beneath the debris. Hospital staff treated casualties in basements lit by emergency generators. And in the morning, as the smoke settled over the river and the docks still smoldered, the buses ran. Not on time, and not on their usual routes, but they ran, navigating around craters and blocked streets, carrying people who had somewhere to be despite everything. Fact number 2. The blackout in Britain was enforced with a seriousness that extended to prosecuting offenders in court. By the end of 1939, over 300,000 people had been prosecuted for blackout violations, showing a light from a window, failing to cover a vehicle headlight properly, or opening a door that allowed indoor light to spill into the street. Fines were issued by magistrates with little sympathy. A woman in Birmingham was fined for the light visible through the gap where her curtains failed to meet by half an inch. A man in London was prosecuted because the glow of his cigarette was visible from outside. Air raid wardens patrolled streets in complete darkness, scanning for any trace of light, with the focused attention of people who understood that a single visible flame could guide a bomb to a street full of sleeping families. The social pressure that accompanied the legal one was equally powerful. Neighbors watched neighbors, and a house showing light was reported not with malice, but with genuine fear. The darkness was collective, maintained by collective vigilance, and the people who kept it understood that its integrity depended on everyone, which gave the enforcement of it a moral weight that went beyond the fine printed on the summons. Fact number 3. The V-1 flying bomb, nicknamed the Doodlebug by British civilians, introduced a form of aerial threat unlike anything that had come before it, and the particular terror it produced was psychological as much as physical. The V-1 was an unmanned aircraft, powered by a pulse jet engine that made a distinctive buzzing sound, audible from miles away. People learned very quickly that the sound itself was not the danger. It was the silence that followed it. When the engine cut out, the bone was falling. Civilians on the streets, in gardens, in shops, in kitchens, learned to listen for that cut-off with the whole body, a collective holding of breath that became one of the defining sensory experiences of the summer of 1944 in southern England. Those who heard the engine stop directly overhead had between 10 and 15 seconds before impact. Some ran, some threw themselves flat. Some simply stood still, understanding that the calculation had already been made and that movement would not change it. The bomb that killed you was the one whose engine you did not hear stop, because it had already landed. Fact number 4. Anderson shelters across Britain flooded so regularly during heavy rain that many families kept a small hand pump specifically for bailing them out before they could be occupied for the night. The shelters sat partly underground in garden soil that had no drainage infrastructure, and the British winter provided ample opportunity for them to fill. Families arrived at their shelter during a raid to find 18 inches of cold water waiting for them, and made the rapid calculation of whether it was safer to bail and occupy or to take their chances in the house. Many chose the house. Some laid duckboards across the water and slept above it on makeshift platforms. Others lined the walls with sandbags to reduce the seepage. The government issued guidance on improving drainage, which arrived, in the tradition of wartime official communications, somewhat after the problem had already been comprehensively experienced. What is remarkable is not the inconvenience, but what people did with it. The rugs brought out and dried each morning, the candles replaced, the cards reshuffled. The shelter returned to its domestic order each day, as though the flooding had been a minor administrative matter, rather than a cold, wet night spent listening to bombs fall somewhere in the middle distance, while standing on a plank above 2 feet of life. Water. Fact number 5. The Morrison shelter, introduced in Britain in 1941 as an indoor alternative to the garden Anderson, was essentially a large steel table designed to be used as furniture during the day and a survival space at night. It was approximately the size of a double bed, made of heavy steel mesh on the sides and a solid steel plate on top, and families slept inside it on the floor during raids, protected from collapse if the building above them came down. The Morrison was intended for homes without gardens, terraced houses, flats, urban dwellings where an Anderson was simply not possible. It was named after Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, and was distributed free to households earning below a certain income. Families who received it reported that adapting to sleeping inside what was effectively a steel cage required a period of psychological adjustment that the accompanying government leaflet had not particularly addressed. Children, however, took to the Morrison with enthusiasm. It became a den, a fort, a private world beneath the table where they kept books and toys and conducted the serious business of childhood in a world that had reorganized itself around the possibility of the ceiling coming down. The shelter served both functions simultaneously. It was, in the most literal sense, a place to live and a place to survive. Fact number 6. Auxiliary fire service volunteers in British cities fought blazes during the Blitz alongside professional firefighters, using equipment they had learned to operate on weekend training days that now seemed entirely inadequate preparation for what they were facing. In London alone, during the height of the Blitz, fire crews attended over 1,000 incidents in a single night on some of the worst raids. The challenge was not only the fires themselves, but the conditions under which they had to be fought. Hoses ran dry when water mains were hit by bombs, leaving crews standing at the edge of infernos with equipment that could not function. Firefighters improvised by running hoses to the Thames directly, pumping river water up through streets to reach fires that the mains could no longer supply. They worked in the dark, under active bombing, in streets where adjacent buildings might collapse without warning. The heat from large fires created their own wind systems that pushed flames in unpredictable directions. Men who had been bus drivers and shop assistants and office workers 6 months earlier directed hoses into burning buildings in the middle of the night, in the middle of a raid, guided by the knowledge that inside those buildings were people who had not yet been found, and that the only way to reach them was through the fire. Fact number 7. Tube stations, used as air raid shelters in London, developed such distinct and stable communities that regular shelterers began to experience a form of territorial attachment to their particular platform that was genuinely social rather than merely practical. People decorated their sections of platform with photographs, small rugs, and personal objects that transformed a few feet of concrete into something recognizable as a home. Arguments about space and noise were resolved through negotiation rather than authority, because the authority of the shelter community was entirely self-generated. A system of seniority developed organically. Those who had been sheltering in a particular station since the beginning of the Blitz had an understood claim to their spot that newcomers recognized and respected. Entertainment organized itself. Sing-alongs began spontaneously on some platforms. Card games ran continuously on others. And at least one station hosted a regular informal lecture series in which a retired school teacher gave talks on British history to whoever wanted to listen. Libraries sent book trolleys through the underground stations. The government, having initially resisted the use of the tube as shelter, eventually installed bunks, improved sanitation, and organized canteens. But the community had been fully formed and fully functional before any of that arrived, built entirely by the people who needed it. Fact number 8. The Women's Voluntary Service ran mobile canteens called Queen's Messengers that were deployed to bombed areas within hours of a raid, arriving with hot food and tea before any other form of official relief had organized itself. The canteens were converted vehicles, buses, vans, adapted trucks, operated by women who drove through streets that had been altered overnight by bomb damage, navigating around craters and collapsed buildings to reach the places where people were standing in the cold, waiting for something warm. The tea served from these canteens has been described in more wartime memoirs and diaries than almost any other single object of the period, which says something about what a cup of hot tea represents to a person who has just spent the night in a shelter and emerged to find their street unrecognizable. It is warmth, obviously, but it is also continuity, the proof that something ordinary is still available, that the world has not been so thoroughly disrupted that a familiar comfort cannot be produced and handed to you in a cup. The women who operated the canteens understood this, which is why they kept the tea hot and kept moving, through the worst nights of the Blitz and through the quieter nights that followed, for as long as people needed them to arrive. Fact number 9. Blackout paint. A thick, dark mixture applied directly to windows to block the passage of light was used by millions of households across Britain and occupied Europe who could not afford or could not obtain proper blackout curtain fabric. The paint was effective, but created its own problems. It blocked not only light going out, but light coming in, which meant that rooms painted against the blackout remained dark even during the day, unless the paint was removed, which defeated the purpose, or unless windows were left open, which in winter created a different problem. Some families applied the paint to the inside of the glass and scraped it clear in patches during the day to let in daylight, reapplying it each evening in a routine that became as fixed as any other domestic task. The paint itself was not always commercially available in sufficient quantities, and households who ran out improvised with whatever dark material could be made to adhere to glass. Boot polish, dark emulsion diluted from other uses. In some cases, a mixture of soot and oil that was effective, if not particularly elegant. The daily maintenance of the blackout, the checking, the covering, the painting and scraping, became simply part of what a home required, like sweeping the floor or banking the fire. Fact number 1. 0. Night raids produced a phenomenon that civil defense planners had not fully anticipated: the formation of what became known informally as shelter communities. Groups of people who had never met before the war, and who now spent every night together underground, with the intimacy that proximity and shared fear creates. In London's deep shelters and tube stations, these communities developed identities and internal cultures within weeks. People knew each other's names, occupations, the names of children, the health conditions of elderly members who needed extra consideration. They saved spots for members who had not yet arrived when the siren sounded. They noticed when someone did not come and asked after them the following night. The relationships formed in those shelters frequently outlasted the raids. People who had met on a tube platform in 1940 maintained friendships into peacetime that would never have formed in any other circumstance. The war compressed social time in ways that peacetime does not. And the shelter community was perhaps the most concentrated expression of that compression. Strangers becoming neighbors, becoming something close to family, in the space of a few months of shared darkness and shared waiting. Fact number 11. The heavy anti-aircraft guns deployed around British cities during the Blitz were not, in the early months, particularly effective at bringing down German aircraft. Their primary function, which civil defense commanders understood and accepted, was psychological rather than military. The sound of the guns firing, the deep concussive boom that could be heard and felt across entire neighborhoods, told the civilian population in the shelters alone that something was being done, that the city was not simply absorbing the attack passively. Survivors of the Blitz described the sound of the guns as genuinely reassuring, in a way that the gun's actual effectiveness did not entirely justify. The noise was company. It meant that people were up there in the dark, operating heavy equipment, returning something to the sky that was coming down at them. By 1941, improved radar systems and gun-laying technology had genuinely increased the gun's effectiveness. But in those first months, it was the sound of them, rather than the results of them, that mattered most to the people below. There is something quietly interesting about a weapon whose most important function was acoustic, whose value lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it said to the people listening from underground about whether or not they had been abandoned to the dark. Fact number 12. Pets in bombed British cities were affected by the raids in ways that their owners found distressing and that required practical management alongside everything else the raids demanded. Dogs in particular responded to the sound of bombs and guns with fear responses, howling, shaking, attempting to escape. That added noise and stress to already difficult shelter conditions. Some owners gave their dogs mild sedatives, obtained from veterinarians, specifically for use during raids. Others trained their animals to enter the shelter on command. a process that required time and patience most households had in short supply. Cats, characteristically, responded to bombing in a range of individual ways. Some became deeply distressed. Others appeared entirely indifferent to the noise, in a manner that some owners found simultaneously admirable and slightly insulting. There were documented cases of dogs who learned to recognize the specific sound of the air raid siren and would lead their owners to the shelter independently before the family had fully registered what they had heard. Animals whose sensory attunement to danger had become a reliable early warning system, operating alongside the official one. The relationship between people and their animals during the raid years was its own small story within the larger one, characterized by the same combination of practical adaptation and genuine affection that ran through most of the civilian experience of those years. Fact number 1. 3. Hospitals across bombed British cities developed emergency protocols during the Blitz that included moving the most seriously ill patients to basement levels when raids began, a procedure that required moving people who were post-operative, connected to equipment, or in conditions that made movement dangerous. The logistics of transferring a ward full of patients to a basement in the middle of a raid, in the dark, with reduced staff, were managed through systems that had been rehearsed, but that the rehearsals had not fully prepared for the reality. Nurses carried patients who could not walk. Doctors disconnected equipment that could be disconnected and carried it with the patient. Generators were kept running to maintain the most critical life support functions. And throughout all of this, the medical staff continued treating new casualties arriving from the raid outside. Some hospitals were hit directly by bombs. St. Thomas's Hospital in London was struck multiple times, its wards exposed to open sky by the damage. Staff working in partially demolished buildings, because the work could not stop, simply because the building had been partially removed from around it. The medical staff who worked through those nights are among the least celebrated figures of the civilian war, present in the middle of it, doing the most necessary thing possible, in conditions that no professional training had been designed to anticipate. Fact number 1. 4. The sound of the all-clear siren, a long, steady, unwavering note, as opposed to the rising and falling wail of the warning, produced a specific and documented emotional response in civilians that was different from simple relief. People who emerged from shelters after the all-clear had sounded described a moment of reorientation that could take several minutes, a process of recalibrating the senses to a world that might look different from the one left behind when the IV sleep. Warning. Immediate questions were practical. Was the house still standing? Was the street passable? Were the neighbors accounted for? But beneath the practical was something quieter, the specific gratitude of having come through another night, accompanied by the knowledge that the following might would bring the same requirement. Diaries from the Blitz period record the all clear in ways that suggest it was not simply the end of an event, but a small daily renegotiation with survival, a moment in which the person writing understood, with a clarity that peacetime rarely produces, that being alive was not guaranteed, and that this particular morning had delivered it again. The sound of it, that long, level, unwavering note, became one of the defining acoustic memories of the period, carrying a weight of association that people who heard it regularly never entirely lost. Fact number 15. Barrage balloons floated above British cities throughout the war, tethered to the ground by steel cables designed to destroy low-flying aircraft that flew into them. By 1940, over 1,400 barrage balloons were deployed over London alone, forming a defensive canopy that forced German bombers to fly at higher altitudes, where their bombing accuracy was reduced. The balloons were operated by crews, many of them women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, who maintained them through wind, rain, and the electrical storms that occasionally caused the cables to conduct charge and the balloons themselves to glow with an eerie blue light that witnesses did water, wide, backward, power, base, strange things. It was a safe and fine rushing life. Dalius, Mandalese, feeling grace and grace. The balloons became a reassuring part of the daytime skyline for civilians below. Large, grey, somewhat bovine shapes drifting at the ends of their cables, with the stolid calm of animals that have been told to stay somewhere and are doing so. Children incorporated them into drawings of the sky. They appeared in the background of wartime photographs with the naturalness of things that have always been there. When they were eventually removed as the bombing threat diminished, some civilians noted the absence with something that surprised them. The sky had been keeping them company in those shapes, and the company had been, without anyone quite deciding it, quietly welcome. Fact number 16. Civil defense workers, who dug through bomb rubble, searching for survivors, operated largely in darkness and largely by sound. The technique was to clear debris to a point where listening became possible, then to stop all work, all digging, all movement, all noise, and wait in complete silence for any sound from below. A tapping, a voice, a movement. Workers described the silence of a rescue pause as one of the most concentrated and attentive experiences of their lives. Every sensory faculty directed at a single point beneath the rubble, the body as still as it could be made. The ears doing what no equipment of the period could do for them. When a sound came through, the rescue accelerated with a controlled urgency that bounced speed, with the knowledge that wrong movement could bring more debris down onto whoever was low. When no sound came, the decision about whether to continue or move to another site was made, but the category of play was easy. When so far in the opening, the silence was planned, trembled, and the people who did this work, night after night, raid after raid, in the cold and the dark and the dust of collapsed buildings, were not celebrated in the way that soldiers were celebrated. They were civilians doing the most human possible thing, which was refusing to leave someone in the dark alone. Fact number 17. German civilians experienced their own version of the Blackouts years as Allied bombing intensified from 1942 onward. The bombing of German cities, Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, brought to German civilian life the same combination of nightly disruption, shelter routines, and daily damage assessment that British civilians had been managing since 1940. German air raid shelters included both public bunkers, massive reinforced concrete structures built into city centres, and private cellars, which varied enormously in their safety depending on the construction of the building above them. Hamburg in July 1943 experienced a series of raids that created a firestorm, a phenomenon in which multiple large fires combine to a single self-sustaining conflagration that generates its own wind system. The temperatures at the center of the Hamburg firestorm reached over 800 degrees Celsius. People in shelters died not from direct bomb impact, but from carbon monoxide poisoning and from superheated air that consumed the oxygen. Civilians who survived described streets in which everything combustible had been consumed, and nothing remained except the strange silence of a city that had been a city and was now something else. The experience of the German civilian population under Allied bombing has been the subject of ongoing historical and ethical debate, but the experience itself, the shelters, the darkness, the damage, the morning after, was recognizable to anyone. Fact number 18. The Firewatch Order of 1944 required British civilians to take turns watching their buildings and streets for incendiary arms during raids, with the specific task of extinguishing small fires before they became large ones. Incendiary bombs, small, magnesium-cased devices, dropped in large numbers, were designed to start fires rather than to create blast damage, and their effectiveness depended on fires being left to develop unchallenged. The fire watchers, who climbed onto rooftops during raids with stirrup pumps and buckets of sand, were doing something that sounds almost absurdly inadequate against the scale of what was falling, and yet the system worked. Fires caught early, before they took hold of the roof structure, could be extinguished with a bucket of sand and a small pump. Fires left for 20 minutes, while the people who might have caught them were in shelters, could not. The fire watchers knew this and acted accordingly, remaining on exposed rooftops in the middle of raids because the alternative was coming down to find the building gone. Many were killed doing this. Many more saved buildings and the people inside them by doing it. The stirrup pump, a simple hand-operated device designed to be used by one person while another held the nozzle, became one of the small iconic objects of the civilian war. Ordinary and essential in the way that the most important things often are. Fact number 19. Blackout conditions across Britain produced a night economy of small improvised solutions that collectively formed a new visual language for navigating darkness. White paint appeared on curbstones, on the bumpers of vehicles, on the edges of steps, on tree trunks at street level. On any surface or a person moving in complete darkness might benefit from a faint reflective marker. Postboxes were painted with a band of luminescent paint. People sewed or painted white stripes onto their dark coats so that they would be visible to drivers whose headlights had been reduced to the narrowest possible slit. Torch use was permitted outdoors, but restricted to a light so dim, tissue paper over the lens was the standard recommendation, that it provided orientation rather than illumination. Shopkeepers navigated their own premises by memory in the dark, minutes between a customer leaving and the door closing, because the door could not be opened while the shop light was on. The cumulative effect of all these small adaptations was the creation of a nocturnal world that operated by entirely different visual rules from anything that had existed before. A world in which the faint and the reflected and the remembered replaced the bright and the seen, and in which people navigated with a combination of memory, touch, and the particular attentiveness to faint signal that darkness teaches to those who spend enough time inside it. Fact number 20. The Blitz produced a specific and documented phenomenon known as Blitz humor, a style of jokes and comic observations that emerged from the bombing experience and that served as a recognized form of psychological management within civilian life. Communities. Bombed-out families displayed handwritten signs on the ruins of their homes. "We are not downhearted, still open for business. Hitler can't beat us." Some of these signs were photographed and reproduced in newspapers, where they served a propaganda function. But their origin was genuine rather than manufactured. They were made by the people whose houses had been destroyed, not by a government communications department. The humor they expressed had a specific character. It acknowledged the damage, refused to be diminished by it, and directed a kind of cheerful defiance at the source of the damage that was more psychologically complex than simple bravado. Maintaining the capacity to make jokes about your own ruined house requires a psychological agility that is not trivial. It requires the ability to hold two things simultaneously: the reality of the loss and the refusal to be defined by it, and to turn that combination into something that makes other people in the same situation laugh. The people who made those signs were doing something genuinely difficult and making it look easy, which is perhaps the most elegant possible definition of what wartime civilian resilience actually was. Fact number 21. The role of the air raid warden included tasks that extended far beyond checking blackout compliance and directing people to shelters. Wardens were expected to know the location of every person living in their sector, including those who might need assistance reaching a shelter, such as elderly residents, people with disabilities, families with very young children, and residents who lived alone. This knowledge was compiled through systematic visits and maintained through regular updating, which meant that wardens had an intimate familiarity with the domestic circumstances of their street that went considerably beyond normal neighborhood acquaintance. They knew which houses had Anderson shelters and which did not. They knew which families had recently had a baby. They knew which elderly residents would need to be walked to the shelter because they could not manage the distance alone in the dark. When a bomb fell on their sector, wardens were the first to know who was unaccounted for, because they knew who should be there. This knowledge was not incidental to the role. It was the role. The warden system worked because it was built on the most granular possible knowledge of a specific community, compiled and maintained by someone who lived inside that community, whose authority derived entirely from that local knowledge and the trust that came with it. Fact number 2. Children in bombed British cities developed coping mechanisms for the raids that varied considerably depending on temperament and circumstance, but shared a common feature: the rapid normalization of what adults around them were experiencing as extraordinary. For many children, the shelter became a place associated not only with fear, but with a particular kind of nighttime intimacy. The closeness of the family in a small space, the candle, the stories told to pass the time. The games played in whispers, while the noise outside did whatever it was going to do. Some children collected shrapnel in the mornings as a form of treasure hunting, competing with friends over who had found the largest or most interestingly shaped piece. The shrapnel was still warm when freshly found. They kept it in tins, traded it, arranged it on windowsills, with the serious collecting instinct of children who have decided that something is worth accumulating. Adults found this disturbing and also, sometimes, quietly useful. A child who was interested in shrapnel was a child who was engaged with the material reality of the war in a way that seemed to reduce rather than amplify fear. The raids were scary in the shelter and interesting afterward, and that sequence, fear followed by curiosity, was one of the more functional relationships a child could develop with something that was simply going to keep happening. Fact number 23. The blackout extended to vehicles in ways that created specific and sometimes dangerous driving conditions throughout the war years. Private cars were permitted headlights reduced to a slit of light, approximately the width of a postcard, directed downward rather than forward, providing just enough illumination to see the road surface immediately in front of the vehicle, but not enough to navigate at normal speed or to be seen by oncoming traffic until both vehicles were extremely close. Bus drivers navigated urban routes they knew from memory, using the faint marks painted on curbstones and the occasional white-painted tree trunk as reference points. Train drivers ran at reduced speeds on unlit tracks, relying on signal systems and their own accumulated knowledge of the route. Pedestrian casualties on roads increased substantially in the early months of the blackout, before the adaptation of walking habits to the new conditions reduced the toll. People learned to walk closer to the inner edge of pavements rather than the road edge. They learned to pause at curbs rather than stepping off automatically. They learned to listen for engines before crossing. The whole pedestrian relationship with the street had to be relearned from the beginning. The assumptions about visibility that peacetime walking had been built on were gone, and what replaced them was a more conscious, more attentive, more careful navigation of familiar space that had become in the dark. Fact number 24. The deep shelters built beneath London in 1940 and 1941. Tunnels excavated below existing tube lines at depths of up to 30 meters were designed to hold 8,000 people each and were intended as the city's most protected refuge against bombing. They were built quickly, under considerable engineering pressure, and when they opened, they provided a level of protection that the shallower tube stations and Garden Anderson shelters could not match. The shelters had bunk beds installed in tiers, canteen facilities, medical posts, and ventilation systems. They smelled of damp concrete, bodies, and cooked food, in a combination that survivors described as immediately and permanently associated with the idea of safety. People who used them regularly formed the same kinds of community that developed in the tube stations: recognizable faces, understood arrangements. The particular social shorthand of people who have been in the same small space together for enough might to have moved past the formal phase of acquaintance. When the raids ended and the deep shelters were no longer needed for civilian protection, several were converted to other wartime uses: communication centers, government offices, storage for national treasures. The Elgin Marbles spent part of the war in a deep shelter beneath London, which is perhaps the most unexpectedly appropriate company they could have found for those particular years. Fact number 25. The introduction of double summertime in Britain during the war, setting clocks 2 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time rather than the usual one, was intended to maximize daylight working hours and reduce the need for artificial light during the cafe. Evening. It had the practical effect of making mornings extremely dark in winter, with sunrise not occurring until well after 9 o'clock in some parts of the country. Children walked as they turned to the school, to the service console in Britain's campaign. Workers arrived at factories before dawn. The strangeness of conducting ordinary morning activities in conditions that felt, by all natural light indicators, like the middle of the night, was absorbed into the general strangeness of wartime civilian life and managed with the same practical acceptance that people applied to everything else. Farmers, whose working hours had always been governed by natural light rather than the clock, found double summertime particularly disorienting. The animals did not recognize the adjustment and required feeding, milking, and managing on biological schedules that had no relationship to the hour displayed on the clock. The human and animal populations of wartime Britain were therefore living, in some important senses, on different time systems, which added one more layer of mild surrealism to a daily life that already had several. Fact number 26. The warden's cry of "put that light out" became the most recognized and frequently imitated phrase of the British home front, a verbal shorthand for the entire blackout experience, but appeared in comedy sketches, was mimicked by children. "I have this my son, and put me in an, again, mention." But the slight absurdity of that authority being exercised over something as small as a gap in a curtain, and the genuine seriousness that underlay the absurdity. Wardens who delivered the call too aggressively were resented. Those who delivered it with a degree of human acknowledgement, a tone that said, "I know this is inconvenient, but we both know why it matters," were generally obeyed without argument, and sometimes thanked. The micropolitics of that relationship between authority, compliance, inconvenience, and shared purpose was played out on thousands of darkened streets every night of the blackout years. And the particular phrase that summarized it became, in the way that the most resonant phrases always do, a container for a whole range of experience that required more than 3 words to fully describe, but that those 3 words somehow managed to hold. Fact number 27. Incendiary bomb attacks on British cities required a civilian response so specific and so time-critical that the government produced detailed instructional films and pamphlets explaining exactly what to do in the 30 seconds between an incendiary landing and its becoming unmanageable. The magnesium-cased bombs burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius and could not be extinguished with water. Water on a magnesium fire causes an explosive reaction. The correct response was dry sand, applied quickly and in sufficient quantity to smother the burning head before the casing had been consumed and the thermite core ignited. Householders who had watched the films knew this and kept buckets of sand at ready points throughout their homes during raid periods. Those who had not watched the films discovered the water problem at first hand, sometimes with results that were significantly worse than the original bomb. The film and pamphlet campaign was one of the more genuinely effective pieces of government civilian communication of the war. It conveyed technical information that directly saved lives and property. Delivered in a format accessible to people with no prior knowledge of thermite chemistry. And it reached enough of the population quickly enough to the fire damage caused by incendiary raids in the months following its distribution. Fact number 28. The psychological experience of waiting for a raid that did not come was, for many civilians, described as almost harder than the raids themselves. During the phony war period of late 1939 and early 1940, air raid warnings were frequently sounded without bombs following, false alarms caused by unidentified aircraft, navigational errors, or overly cautious reporting. Civilians would gather their things, descend to shelters, wait in the cold and the dark, and then emerge an hour later to find the street unchanged and the sky empty. This happened repeatedly. The disruption to sleep and routine accumulated. The emotional mobilization required to respond to a siren, the adrenaline, the gathering of essential items, the physical movement to the shelter was significant. And experiencing it repeatedly, for no outcome, produced a particular form of exhaustion that was neither the exhaustion of sustained fear, nor the exhaustion of physical effort, but something specific to the condition of repeated, interrupted preparation. Some civilians began to develop their own judgment about whether a warning required immediate response, or whether it could be monitored from the doorway before committing to the shelter. This individual risk assessment was technically against civil defense regulations and practically inevitable. The body and mind have limited reserves of mobilization, and people learned, as people always do, to ration them. Fact number 29. Rescue dogs were deployed at bomb sites across Britain during the Blitz to locate survivors beneath rubble. The dogs, primarily German Shepherds and Labrador Retrievers, trained specifically for search work, could detect the scent of living people through several feet of collapsed masonry and debris, reducing the time required to locate survivors to a fraction of what purely manual searching required. The handlers who worked with these dogs described the animal's behavior at a find as unmistakable: a specific alertness, a change in body posture, a concentrated attention directed at a point in the rubble that the dog communicated with a precision that was difficult for language to improve on. The Civil Defense Rescue Service formally incorporated trained search dogs into their operations as evidence of their effectiveness accumulated, and the dogs became a recognized component of bomb site response. Some dogs became locally known by name in their areas of operation. Individual animals whose particular records of finds were tracked by the services they worked with. The relationship between the rescue worker and the search dog at a bomb site in the middle of the night, the human's willingness to trust the animal's senses completely, The animals' and ambiguous commitment to the task was one of the more quietly remarkable partnerships produced by the civilian side of the war. Fact number 30. Night raids on British cities produced a category of damage to cultural and historical buildings that caused a specific and separately felt grief, alongside the loss of homes and the injury of people. The bombing of the Coventry Cathedral in November 1940, in a raid that destroyed approximately a third of the city, produced a response that went beyond the practical loss. The medieval cathedral's ruins became a symbol that was used by the British government, by artists, and by civilians themselves to express something about what was being defended and what was being destroyed simultaneously. The long inheritance of a civilization being bombed by a part of that same civilization. Christopher Wren churches in the city of London were hit. Medieval guild halls were destroyed. Libraries containing irreplaceable collections were burned. The Holland House Library in London was photographed with 3 men reading among the ruins, surrounded by books that had survived, while the building above them had not. That photograph, the image of people reading in rubble, became one of the defining images of the Blitz. Not because it was staged, or because it was exceptional, but because it captured something true about what the raids were actually targeting, and what was refusing, in the most literal possible way, to stop. Fact number 31. The blackout had unexpected effects on astronomy and stargazing in British cities that were noted and recorded with appreciation by those who happened to look up. Urban skies that had been effectively invisible due to light pollution for decades became, under the blackout, genuinely dark. The Milky Way was visible from central London for the first time in living memory for many of its residents. Amateur astronomers who had previously needed to travel to the countryside to observe anything beyond the brightest stars found themselves able to work from their own back gardens. Some people who had never looked at the sky with any attention before the war described discovering it during the backlash with something between surprise and gratitude. A world that had always been above them, invisible behind the glow of the city, suddenly and completely present. The observation was made by several diarists with a specific awareness of its irony. The bombing that was trying to destroy the city had, as an unintended side effect, returned to it one of the oldest human experiences. The experience of standing under a fully dark sky and seeing what is actually there. The bombs fell from that sky. The stars were in it. Both things were true at the same time, which is perhaps as accurate a summary as any of what the blackout years actually contained. Fact number 32. The V-2 rocket, which Germany began firing at Britain in September 1944, differed from every other aerial threat of the war in one crucial way. It arrived faster than sound. Let's go 10. The day before the war, the break is no more. The first indication that a V-2 had landed was the explosion itself, followed a moment later by the sonic boom of its arrival. There was no warning. No siren could have been useful. No shelter procedure applied. The bomb had already fallen before the sound of it reached you. This created a psychological experience that was qualitatively different from the V1 or the conventional bombing raid. There was nothing to listen for, nothing to respond to, no procedure that made any difference to whether you survived or not. Civil defense authorities recognized that there was nothing useful to tell the civilian population about protecting themselves from V2s, and initially attempted to suppress the fact that the explosions were caused by rockets rather than conventional bombs. When the information was eventually released, the civilian response was, in a pattern consistent with everything else the bombing years had produced, an adaptation rather than a collapse. People continued doing what they had been doing, because there was no version of the V2 experience that behavior could improve, and the human capacity to live with an unmanageable risk by simply continuing turned out to be, once again, more robust than anyone had a particular right to expect. Fact number 33. The maintenance of the blackout at sea required merchant vessels crossing the North Atlantic to operate without any navigational lights, in complete darkness, while carrying the supplies that kept Britain functioning through the war. The men aboard these ships navigated in convoy, following the ship ahead by keeping its silhouette against the sky, a margin of safety that was razor thin and dependent on conditions that the Atlantic did not reliably provide. Collisions in convoy darkness were not uncommon. Ships that fell behind lost the protection of the convoy and became immediately more vulnerable to submarine attack. The blackout that protected cities on land was extended to the water as the same principle: no light, no target. In conditions where darkness brought its own dangers alongside the protection it offered. The merchant seamen who operated under these conditions were civilians, not members of the Royal Navy, but workers in a civilian maritime service whose casualties over the course of the war were proportionally among the highest of any group in day. Britain. They maintained their blackout, they kept their position in convoy, they delivered their cargo, and they did it in conditions of cold and darkness and submarine threat that made the discomforts of the home front feel, by comparison, like the minor inconveniences they mostly were. Fact number 34. The Civil Defence Service in Britain trained over 1.5 million volunteers during the war years in roles that included rescue, first aid, decontamination, and communication. The training was compressed by necessity. People who in peacetime might have spent years acquiring professional emergency skills were given weeks or months of intensive instruction and then placed in operational roles where the training met reality. With whatever gap it left unfilled, first aid volunteers trained in church halls on weekends and then applied what they had learned to casualties at bomb sites where the specific injuries they were encountering, blast trauma, crash injuries, burns from incendiary material, had not all been covered in the training manual. Decontamination teams trained to respond to gas attacks that never came deployed their skills instead to the management of dust, debris, and the material aftermath of high explosive blast. The flexibility of application, the willingness to take a skill acquired for one purpose and use it for another, was characteristic of the Civil Defence Service and characteristic more broadly of the civilian adaptation to wartime conditions. What you had trained for was not always what you were needed for, and the most useful quality turned out to be not the specific skill, but the general readiness to turn up and do whatever was needed when you got there. Fact number 35. The noise environment of a major bombing raid produced physical effects in nearby civilians that went beyond the psychological. Blast waves from large explosions caused burst eardrums, disoriented the vestibular system, and produced a phenomenon known as blast lung in those close enough to the detonation point. Damage to the lung tissue caused by the pressure wave passing through the body without leaving a visible external wound. People near large explosions frequently reported temporary deafness, tinnitus, and a ringing that could last for days. The cumulative effect on those who experienced multiple raids over weeks and months was a background of auditory disruption, a world that was slightly less clear, slightly more effortful to hear clearly, that added to the general sensory wear of the bombing period. First aid workers at bomb sites learned to recognize blast-affected casualties by the specific quality of their confusion, a disorientation that was different from the confusion of fear or injury, and that required a different kind of reassurance. The physical effects of blast on the body were not fully understood by the medical community at the time, and were often attributed to psychological causes, The syndrome that would later be recognized as blast-related injury was frequently dismissed in the 1940s as simply the consequence of being frightened, which was both partially true and compressively inadequate as a description. Fact number 36. Wartime cinema attendance in Britain actually increased during the Blitz years rather than declining, which surprised commentators at the time and has interested historians since. People went to the cinema more during the bombing than they had before it, despite the obvious risk of being in a public building during a raid. Cinemas developed their own raid protocols, displaying a notice on screen when a warning had been issued and allowing patrons to choose whether to leave or remain. Most chose to remain. The films shown ranged from Hollywood escapism to British documentary, but what they provided in common was 2 hours of sustained attention directed at something other than the war, a temporary realignment of consciousness away from the present and into a narrative that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. At a time when the narrative people were living had none of these things in any visible way. Projection booths were staffed through raids. Projectionists kept the film running while the building shook. The audience sat in the dark watching a different darkness on the screen. And for those 2 hours, the specific darkness they were sitting in was temporarily replaced by something that could be followed, interpreted, and eventually resolved, which was more than the war outside was offering anyone at that particular moment. Fact number 37. The management of light inside bombed buildings posed specific challenges for rescue workers operating in structures that had partially collapsed. Conventional lighting could not be used in environments where gas pipes might be fractured. A spark in a gas-filled basement could trigger a secondary explosion, far more damaging than the original bomb. Rescue teams developed protocols for testing atmospheres before introducing any light source, using canaries in some documented instances, the same method used in coal mines, and later using purpose-built gas detection equipment. Work in confirmed gas-free environments was conducted with hooded lanterns that directed light downward into the working area, rather than outward in any direction that might be visible from above. The combination of the need for darkness from the blackout perspective and the need for darkness from the gas safety perspective created rescue environments of near-total sensory deprivation, in which workers navigated largely by touch and sound, passing information to each other in low voices, and developing through practice a tactile competence with the material of collapsed buildings that was not teachable in any formal setting, but accumulated through experience into a genuine expertise. Fact number 38. Underground war rooms and command centres were constructed beneath British cities during the war to allow government and military functions to continue, even if the surface buildings above them were destroyed. The cabinet war rooms beneath Westminster, where Churchill and his cabinet met during the worst of the bombing, were a warren of low-ceilinged rooms cut into the basement of a government building and reinforced with a concrete slab above. The people who worked in them did so in artificial light, without windows, with ventilation systems that could not fully compensate vast full metals of the smoking light of a time. Secretaries and clerks who processed the paperwork of government decision-making worked in these rooms around the clock, aware that what moved through their hands was determining the course of the war, but unable to see the sky or know what the weather was doing, or whether the street above them was still standing. The disconnection between the physical environment of the war rooms, cramped, airless, underground, lit by bulbs, and the scale of what was being decided inside them, was a feature of wartime governance that the people who experienced it described with a combination of pride and a persistent low-level claustrophobia that some found never entirely left them. Fact number 3. Now, the emotional experience of the morning after a heavy raid was described consistently across accounts from different cities, different countries, and different years as having a specific and recognizable quality, unlike ordinary mourning. People emerge from shelters and basements and underground stations into a version of their street or neighborhood that might have changed overnight, in ways ranging from minor debris to complete destruction. The immediate response was an inventory, a rapid visual survey of the known landscape for what was still in place and what was not. The house on the corner, the postbox, the tree that had been there since before you could remember. These anchor points, checked automatically and unconsciously, told you where you were in a world that might have been substantially rearranged while you were underground. Those whose anchor points were still standing felt something that is distinct from happiness, but close to it, a bodily relief that the known world had held. Those who found anchor points gone experienced something that is distinct from grief, but adjacent to it, a specific, disorienting loss of orientation in landscape that had previously been so familiar as to be invisible, suddenly requiring conscious attention because the automatic navigation map had ceased to be accurate. Fact number 40, Chapter 9, Part 2. The government's decision to continue publishing newspapers throughout the Blitz, ensuring that the daily paper was produced and distributed regardless of what had happened overnight, was understood by the press and by the public as a statement of death, continuity that had significance beyond its practical function. Printing presses ran in buildings that had sometimes been damaged in the previous night's raid. Journalists filed stories about the raid that had just occurred, while standing in the rubble of buildings in which those stories would be set. The papers arrived on doorsteps in the morning, thinner than peacetime editions, produced on reduced paper stock, with columns that acknowledged the damage directly rather than minimizing it, and their arrival was experienced by many civilians as one of the most concrete available proofs that the normal order of things had not been entirely disrupted. Not because the news was good, which it frequently was not, but because the newspaper itself had arrived, which meant that the machinery of ordinary life was still turning over, still producing its daily outputs, still treating the reader as someone who needed to know what had happened and was capable of receiving that information and going about their day. The paper was thin. It arrived. That was enough. Fact number 41. The blackout affected the experience of music in unexpected ways. Concert halls that remained open during the war years created a specific atmospheric experience. Audiences arriving in complete darkness, finding their seats without ushers equipped with torches, settling into their places before the lights inside came on. The transition from the absolute darkness of the street to the relative warmth of an illuminated concert hall was described by multiple accounts as producing a heightened sense of arrival, a contrast effect in which the light felt more welcoming and core, the music more present than it would have in normal circumstances. The pianist Myra Hess, whose National Gallery lunchtime concerts became one of the most celebrated institutions of the London Blitz, described the audiences as listening with a quality of attention she had not encountered in peacetime, as though the darkness outside and the uncertainty of the times had stripped away the social distractions of concert-going and left something more direct between the music and the people receiving it. Whether the blackout itself produced this effect, or whether it was the broader circumstances of the war acting through it, the testimony of those who attended wartime concerts consistently notes that the music sounded different. Not acoustically different, but experientially different. Received by people for whom the question of what was worth holding on to had become suddenly and practically urgent. Fact number 42. Civil defense planning in Britain before the war had included detailed preparations for the management of civilian dead on a scale that the planners expected bombing to produce. Cardboard coffins were manufactured and stored. Paper body tags were printed by the millions. Designated sites for mass burial were identified in parks and open spaces. The scale of civilian casualties that pre-war planners anticipated, based on calculations derived from the relatively small bombing of the First World War, was catastrophically overestimated. The actual death toll from bombing in Britain, while terrible in individual human terms, was far below the figures that had caused the pre-war preparations to be made. The cardboard coffins sat in storage, mostly unused. The mass burial sites were not required. The tags were issued in numbers well below what had been printed. The gap between the preparation and the reality was never publicly acknowledged in any formal sense. The existence of the preparations was not something the government found it useful to discuss with the population for whom they had been made. But the preparations existed, and people who encountered them in the course of civil defense work knew what they represented. The knowledge that the government had made those preparations, and why, was one of the quieter facts of the home front, not unknown, but not spoken of, filed alongside the other things the war years taught about the distance in between. Fact number 43. The experience of conducting ordinary domestic life in a bombed or partially bombed building became sufficiently common in British cities that government guidance was issued on when a structure was safe to continue occupying and when it was not. Blast damage from nearby explosions frequently left buildings standing but structurally compromised. Windows blown in, ceilings cracked, walls shifted off plot. Families who returned to damaged homes made their own assessments of habitability, guided partly by official advice and partly by practical necessity. A house with its windows blown out, but its roof and structure intact, was, in winter, extremely cold, but preferable to temporary accommodation, if a family had the resources to board up the windows and manage the cold. A house with a shifted wall was a different calculation. Many families continue to occupy significantly damaged houses for months or years before repairs were made, managing around the damage with a resourcefulness that had by then become habitual. Visitors to London in the middle years of the war described streets where fully occupied homes sat immediately adjacent to complete ruins, a patchwork of habitation and destruction in which the line between where people lived and where no one could live anymore was drawn not by formal assessment, but by the individual calculations of families who had somewhere to be and insufficient alternatives to be anywhere else. Fact number 44. The smell of a bombed city was distinctive enough to be described in consistent terms by people who experienced different cities in different countries across the war years. The combination of dust from pulverized masonry, gas from fractured pipes, burning wood and fabric, and the particular smell of building materials that have been subjected to explosive force produces something that those who encountered it described as immediately and permanently recognizable, a smell that, years and decades later, specific materials or combinations of dust and burning could suddenly and involuntarily return. Survivors of the Blitz described being brought back completely to a specific raid, a specific street, a specific night, by the smell of building dust encountered in a completely different context decades later. This involuntary memory function of smell, its capacity to bypass the conscious management of memory and return a person to an experience with physical completeness, meant that the olfactory record of the bombing years persisted in the survivors, in ways that the visual and verbal records did not fully overlap. The smell of the Blitz was not the same as the sight of it, or the sound of it, or the knowledge of it. It was something the body retained independently of what the mind had decided to remember, held in a part of the nervous system that does not respond to the instruction to move on. Fact number 45. The blackout created conditions in which the visual arts had to adapt in specific ways. Artists working during the blackout found that natural light, the basis of most traditional studio practice, was available only during shortened winter days, and that artificial light of the quality needed for detailed work was difficult to maintain without blackout violations. The painter Edward Ardizoni kept detailed records of working by candlelight during raids and in blackout conditions, noting the specific quality of candlelit work, the warm, limited, directional light that flattened certain colors and intensified others, producing an aesthetic that some artists found worth exploring in its own right, rather than simply managing as a constraint. Official war artists, commissioned to document the civilian experience of the bombing, produced work that engaged directly with the specific visual conditions of the blackout years. The contrast between the orange glow of fires and the absolute darkness of unlit streets, the strange illumination of searchlight beams, the textures of damage seen in the half-light of early morning after a raid. The visual record of the blackout was produced by people working inside it, under its conditions, with the limitations it imposed, and the specific visual experiences it offered. And those conditions are present in the work, in ways that studio reconstruction could not have produced. Fact number 46. The role of women in civil defense and nighttime emergency work during the Blitz expanded beyond what pre-war planning had anticipated or explicitly permitted. Women drove ambulances through bombed streets to collect casualties. They staffed first aid posts that operated throughout raids. They served as telephonists in the communications networks that kept rescue coordination functioning when surface infrastructure was damaged. Women in the auxiliary fire service operated pumps and managed equipment at fire sites, working alongside the men who had been trained for the same roles. The expansion was not the result of a formal policy decision, but of the practical reality that the people who had been planned for, predominantly male, were in some sectors insufficient in number for the demand, and that the women who presented themselves to do the work were capable of doing it. The experience accumulated through the Blitz of women managing emergency work at night in dangerous conditions was one of the pieces of evidence that accumulated during the war years, and that, added together, made the pre-war claims about women's limitations look, retrospectively, like a position that had never had a particularly strong factual basis, and that the specific conditions of the Blitz had tested, quickly and comprehensively, to breaking point. 16-17-5-1842. Fact number 4. The government's wartime social survey conducted interviews with civilians about their experiences and attitudes throughout the war, generating an archive of testimony that provides a ground-level view of civilian psychological experience during the bombing that official records did not capture. The survey documented attitudes toward the raids, toward the government's management of civil defense, toward the blackout regulations. It found consistently that civilians' trust in the official information they were given was conditional. People believed the news that matched what they could see and discounted the news that did not. It found that the social integration produced by the shared experience of the raids was real, but not universal. Communities that had strong pre-existing social bonds held together more effectively than those that had not. It found that the practical management of day-to-day life, the ration, the shelter, the blackout, was experienced as more stressful than the raids themselves by a significant proportion of respondents. which was not what civil defense planners had expected, and which required some readjustment of the official understanding of what the civilian experience of the war actually consisted of. The survey's findings were filed and used by planners. They are now used by historians. Fact number 48. The impact of the raids on children's sleep was severe enough to be documented medically during the war years. Children who experienced regular raids showed elevated rates of bedwetting, nightmares, and daytime anxiety symptoms that were recognized as stress-related even within the limited psychological framework of the period. Pediatricians noted that the pattern of sleep disruption, the late-night siren, the move to the shelter, the irregular return to bed, the uncertainty about when the next disruption would come, was precisely the pattern most damaging to the sleep architecture of developing children. Schools reported increases in difficulty concentrating, irritability, and what teachers described as a general flatness in children who had been through heavy raid periods. Some evacuated children who had been sent to quiet rural areas and were away from both family and bombing showed better outcomes on these measures than children who remained in cities with their families, a finding that presented parents with a painful set of competing priorities about what their children most needed. Those who stayed with their families and endured the raids together generally showed more resilience in the long term than those who were separated. But the sleep disruption and its immediate effects were real and cumulative, and not adequately managed by any official provision of the period. Fact number 49. The WWII attacks on Britain in the summer of 1944 produced a specific civilian defense response that was partly organized, partly spontaneous, and entirely characteristic of the improvisation that had defined the civilian relationship with aerial threat since 1940. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned to coastal areas to engage the V-1 since before they reached populated areas. Barrage balloon cables were used to catch and deflect them. RAF pilots developed a technique of flying alongside V-1s and tipping their wings to destabilize the gyroscope that guided them, causing them to crash in unpopulated areas. And civilians, for their part, developed, independently and without instruction, the collective behavioral response of watching and listening for the buzzing engine and then throwing themselves flat when it cut out. The democratization of air defense, the direct participation of the civilian body in the act of managing the threat, had been a feature of the blackout years from the beginning. But the V-1 made it literal and visceral in a way that even the most experienced Blitz veteran found new. The bomb was visible. Its engine was audible. Its behavior in the moments before impact was readable. The people on the ground became, in the most practical sense, participants in a real-time assessment of where it was going to fall, using the information available to them to make rapid decisions about whether and in which direction to move. Fact number 50. The blackout years produced changes in urban social behavior that outlasted the war in some respects and disappeared the moment it ended in others. The habit of navigating in near total darkness, of using senses other than vision as the primary tool for moving through familiar space, was reported by many civilians as having produced a lasting attentiveness to the non-visual world that peacetime light had previously suppressed. People who had spent years navigating by sound and touch described noticing, after the war, that they listened to their surroundings more carefully than they had before, and that they were aware of spatial information, the acoustic signature of a room, the texture of a surface, that the availability of easy light had previously made unnecessary to attend to. The social behaviors that had developed around the blackout, the community management of darkness, the mutual assistance with navigation, the specific intimacy of people who had spent nights together in the same dark space, dissolved quickly once streetlights were restored and windows could again show their light to the street. The community of the blackout was a temporary construction, built by necessity and dismantled by its removal, which is perhaps the clearest possible demonstration of what necessity actually creates in communities, and what the absence of necessity, just as swiftly, allows to fade. Fact number 5. The Baedeker raids of 1942, a series of German attacks on British cities chosen specifically for their cultural and historical significance, rather than their military or industrial value, targeted Bath, Exeter, Norwich, York, and Canterbury. The raids were named after the Baedeker tourist guidebooks to Britain that Germany used to select targets, and they were explicitly framed by German authorities as retaliation for British bombing of the historic German city of Lübeck. The civilian experience of these raids was different in character from the Blitz experience of London and industrial cities. The cities targeted were smaller, less prepared in terms of civil defense infrastructure, and less accustomed to the raid routine that Londoners had spent 2 years developing. Bath, with its Georgian architecture and its identity as a city of culture and leisure, rather than industrial production, had fewer reinforced shelters and less experienced warden networks. The damage to a replaceable architecture was severe. The raids produced something that London's Blitz had not quite produced in the same form, a grief specifically for the built heritage that had been lost, for the rooms and streets and buildings that had held centuries of ordinary life and that were now gone in a sequence of nights that had chosen them not for strategic value, but precisely because of what they represented. Fact number 5. 2. The experience of sheltering underground during raids produced physical symptoms in a significant number of civilians that were related to the specific environmental conditions of underground spaces rather than to the bombing itself. The combination of poor ventilation, large numbers of bodies in a small space, and the absence of normal hygiene facilities produced elevated humidity, elevated carbon dioxide concentrations, and temperature extremes that caused physical discomfort and, in some cases, actual medical effects. Doctors attending to shelter populations documented cases of what they called shelter illness, a cluster of respiratory symptoms, headaches, and general malaise that was associated specifically with time spent in heavily occupied shelters. The government responded by improving ventilation in the deep shelters and cheap stations, installing better sanitation, and posting medical personnel at the larger shelter sites. For those using Garden Anderson shelters, the environmental quality was different, colder and damper but better ventilated, and the health effects were correspondingly different, though the cold and damp created their own set of respiratory risks, particularly for elderly occupants and young children. The medical management of civilian health under blackout and shelter conditions was one of those areas of the civilian war that received less attention than it deserved at the time, and that has been somewhat under-researched. Fact number 5. 3. The acoustic experience of the Blitz, the specific sounds of a bombing raid heard from underground, was described in enough detail by enough different people to constitute a reliable auditory record of what it was like to be below ground while bombs fell above. The sound sequence was consistent: the rising wail of the siren, then a period of relative quiet in which the engines of approaching aircraft could sometimes be heard, then the concussive thud of bombs landing at a distance, growing closer in a pattern that depended on where the aircraft were headed, then the specific crack of a near miss, a different quality of sound from the distant thud, involving a physical pressure wave rather than simply a sound wave. And then the guns, and then, eventually, the long, steady note of the all clear. People in shelters who had been through multiple raids developed the competence at reading the soundscape, gauging the distance of bombs from their sound, assessing the direction of aircraft from the pattern of engine noise, making inferences about whether the raid was passing over or settling in. This sonic literacy was acquired through experience that no one had sought and that no formal education provided. It accumulated in the body over weeks of listening from underground, a knowledge that was felt as much as heard. Fact number 5. 4. The blackout had measurable effects on crime rates in British cities that produced an initial increase in certain categories of offence, followed in capture, on which unique mentions were made. Pickpocketing and robbery in darkened streets increased significantly in the early months of the blackout, when the adaptation of police patrol patterns to the new conditions had not yet caught up with the opportunities that complete darkness provided for opportunistic crime. Looting of bombed buildings was treated with particular severity by courts. It carried the possibility of the death penalty under defense regulations, though this was rarely applied because of the specific moral transgression involved in stealing from people who had just lost their homes. The social pressure against looting was also intense. Communities that had survived raids together extended a specific protection to the property of neighbors who had been bombed out, and the person seen removing items from a bombed building by people who recognized them could expect a response that preceded any formal legal process. Blackout crime remained a persistent feature of the war years, but never reached the levels that early commentators had feared, partly because of enforcement, and partly because of the same community solidarity that produced the shelter communities and the Firewatch volunteers. The tendency of shared threat to raise the threshold of behavior. Fact number 5. 5. The experience of the bombing for people with visual impairments revealed something about the blackout that sighted civilians only gradually came to understand. That navigation in darkness is a skill that can be learned, and that those who had already learned it had a form of competence that the blackout suddenly made relevant to everyone. Blind and visually impaired civilians who had developed systems for navigating their neighborhoods by memory and touch found, during the blackout, that the advantage they normally had in their own homes, complete familiarity with the spatial layout, now extended partially to the street, where sighted neighbors were suddenly navigating with comparable uncertainty. There are documented accounts of blind civilians guiding sighted neighbors to shelters during raids, which inverted the usual relationship between sight and assistance, in a way that several of the people involved found both practically useful and psychologically significant. The temporary equalizing effect of the blackout, the redistribution of navigational competence away from sight and toward memory and other senses, were one of the more unexpected of its social effects. Small in scale, but pointed in what it demonstrated about the contingent nature of ability and the specific ways in which different environments create different hierarchies of human competence. Fact number 5. 6. The government's insistence on maintaining normal postal deliveries through the Blitz extended to the internal communications of the civil defense network itself. The messages, reports, and instructions that moved between wardens, rescue services, hospitals, and central command depended on a combination of telephone, messenger, and written communication that had to continue functioning even when bombing damaged the infrastructure it relied on. Civil defense messenger services employed teenagers, boys and girls as young as 14, who cycled through bombed streets during and after raids, carrying communications between posts whose telephone lines had been cut. These young messengers navigated streets blocked by debris, diverted around craters, and passed close to buildings that were still on fire, carrying messages whose contents they were not always told because security required compartmentalization. Some were killed, most were not, and their testimony afterwards describes the specific combination of fear and exhilaration that characterizes adolescent engagement with danger. The awareness of risk, the competence in managing it, and the particular satisfaction of being genuinely useful in a way that required real skill and real courage, rather than the simulated versions that peacetime offered young people. Fact number 57. The practice of fire watching on rooftops during raids produced a specific category of nighttime experience that was unique to the civilian war. Fire watchers, who spent nights on rooftops during raids, occupied a position that was simultaneously the most dangerous available, exposed to blast and shrapnel with no shelter overhead, and the most comprehensive view of the raid available to anyone at ground level. From a rooftop in London during a major raid, a fire watcher could see the full panorama of the bombing, the parachute flares dropped by Pathfinder aircraft to illuminate targets, the oaring trajectories of tracer fire from anti-aircraft guns, the fires already burning across the city, the searchlights sweeping the sky in slow arcs, and the occasional silhouette of an aircraft caught in the crossing beams. The experience was described by those who underwent it as terrifying, and also in a way that they found difficult to fully justify. Magnificent, the word that appeared most frequently in accounts, was spectacle, deployed with the specific discomfort of people who recognized that the right word for their experience was also entirely the wrong word for the event that was producing it. The fire watcher's rooftop view of the Blitz was perhaps the closest that any civilian came to a comprehensive sensory experience of what was actually happening, and the price of that comprehensiveness was the exposure that made it available. Fact number 58. The specific challenge of conducting a romantic life under blackout conditions was the subject of sufficient public comment during the war years to constitute a recognized social phenomenon. The darkness that had been created to protect the population from German bombers also, as a side effect, created cover for meetings and encounters that daylight and normal street lighting would have made more public. This was noted by contemporary commentators with a mixture of concern, humor, and pragmatic acceptance that was characteristic of wartime public discourse on matters that could not be straightforwardly managed. Couples who met during blackout walks, and who would not have met otherwise, credited the darkness with the beginning of relationships that, in some cases, lasted for decades. Tom and Mella, Spartan. He sat on campus with the police that he was trying. The social geography of courtship, which depended in peacetime on the visibility of people in public spaces, was fundamentally altered by the blackout in ways that created new opportunities alongside the obvious risks. Air raid shelters, too, produced their own intimacies. People thrown together in small spaces by circumstances rather than by choice, spending nights in proximity that normal social conventions would never have created, discovering in that forced closeness connections that would not have formed in any other setting. The war disrupted many things. Human sociability was not among them. Fact number 5. Radio became the primary means by which the government communicated with the civilian population during the blackout years, and the specific conventions of wartime broadcasting, the measured delivery, the acknowledgement of difficulty, the absence of the false brightness that characterized some official communications, shaped a relationship between broadcaster and audience that set a standard which post-war broadcasting struggled to maintain. The BBC's 9 o'clock news became a ritual with a near sacred quality in many households, families gathering in silence, someone turning up the volume, everyone listening without interruption, and then a moment of collective processing before speaking. What made it trusted was not that it always brought good news, it frequently did not, but that it did not pretend that the news was better than it was. The BBC's editorial decision to be straightforwardly honest about setbacks within the limits of military security was experienced by the civilian audience as a form of respect, the broadcaster treating the listener as an adult, capable of receiving accurate information without collapsing. That respect was what built the trust, and the trust, accumulated over years of wartime broadcasting, produced a relationship between the BBC and its audience that constituted one of the most significant civic inheritances of the blackout years. Fact number 6. Zip. The end of the blackout in Britain. The official restoration of street lighting and the removal of the requirement to cover windows occurred in stages rather than at a single moment, and the experience of light returning to cities was described by civilians with an emotional intensity that suggests how deeply the years of darkness had settled into the body and into the sense of what normal was. Streetlights, coming on for the first time in years, produced spontaneous gatherings in some neighborhoods, people standing in the street looking at lights as though they were something remarkable, which they were, because for 5 years they had been something that did not exist. Shop windows that could again show their contents to the street attracted people who stood looking at displays with an attention that had nothing to do with purchasing and everything to do with the pleasure of light on objects, freely visible, the simple and previously unremarkable fact of a lit window at night. The blackout had lasted long enough to make the ordinary extraordinary, simply by removing it and then returning it. A process that works on any sense if you apply it long enough, stripping the familiar of its invisibility and returning it, briefly, to the condition of something seen for the first time. Fact number 61. The physical management of blackout curtains became one of the small but persistent daily tasks of wartime domestic life. Washing, rehinging, checking for wear, replacing when necessary. That fell primarily to women managing households, and that required both time and materials that were themselves in limited supply. Heavy blackout fabric was rationed along with other cloth, and replacement curtains required coupon allocation as well as money. Curtains that wore thin over time allowed light to pass through at a level that was technically a violation, even if invisible to the casual observer. It was the job of the warden on patrol to establish through systematic observation from outside whether the blackout at any given address was being properly maintained. The institutional fabric of the blackout, the wardenship, the regular patrol, the system of reporting and prosecution required the maintenance of individual households' blackout curtains to be reliable enough to sustain the integrity of the whole. Every gap in every curtain, in every window, was, in the logic of the blackout, a potential navigation aid for an aircraft over the city. The domestic task of maintaining the curtains was therefore not merely a domestic task, but an act of collective security that linked the private space of the home to the public project of the city's defense. In a direct and daily way. Fact number 62. The experience of air raids on British provincial cities that had received less preparation and less warning infrastructure than London was, in some respects, more disorienting than the London Blitz. Cities like Coventry, Plymouth, Southampton, and Liverpool received heavy and sometimes sustained bombing, for which their civil defense arrangements, while not absent, were less robust than those that had developed in the capital through a year of intensive raiding. Plymouth was bombed on 59 separate nights between 1940 and 1944. The city centre was progressively destroyed over successive raids until some areas had been so comprehensively demolished, and the geography that residents had used to orient themselves had been replaced by rubble fields that required constant mental updating. The experience of living in a city that was changing faster than memory could keep pace with, where the map in your head was consistently behind the reality in front of your eyes, produced a specific form of disorientation that went beyond the code. Immediate effects of individual raids and accumulated into a lasting uncertainty about the stability of the physical world in which ordinary life was supposed to take place. Fact number 63. The care of the elderly in bombed cities during the blackout years presented specific challenges that civil defense planning had not fully addressed. Older residents, who were less mobile, living alone, without the social networks that younger people used to manage the raid routine, were among the most vulnerable members of bombed communities. Wardens were specifically charged with knowing which elderly residents in their sector needed assistance reaching shelters, but the knowledge was only useful if the warden could reach the resident before or quickly after the raid began, which was not always possible. Some elderly civilians refused to use shelters at all, a phenomenon documented across the war years that reflected a combination of genuine inability to manage the discomfort of shelter conditions, a fatalistic acceptance of whatever fate the bombs delivered, and in some cases, a simply stated refusal to spend what might be the final years of a life sleeping on a concrete floor in a cold hole in the garden. These refusals were neither uncommon nor entirely unreasonable, and the wardens and neighbors who encountered them found in the response of some elderly residents to the bombing something that they describe, in retrospect, with a mixture of exasperation and admiration, an acknowledgement that the decision to die in your own bed rather than survive in someone else's shelter was a form of self-determination that the war had not quite managed to strip. Fact number 64. The specific visual phenomenon of incendiary bombs falling at night was described by civilians who witnessed it as possessing a paradoxical beauty that they found immediately disturbing to acknowledge. The magnesium bombs fell in clusters from aircraft, burning as they descended with a white-blue light that, seen from a distance, resembled fireworks, cascades of bright falling points against the dark sky, settling onto rooftops and streets and open ground, and continuing to burn where they landed. People who saw this and recognized it for what it was experienced the collision between the visual impression and its meaning with the specific discomfort, the beauty of the thing that was trying to burn down where you lived. Diaries and memoirs from the period contain careful, slightly guilty descriptions of this visual experience. The writers noting the quality of light with the precision of people who cannot entirely prevent their senses from registering what they are seeing before their judgment catches up and reasserts the appropriate response. The incendiary attack on the city of London on the night of December 29th, 1940, which threatened to destroy the medieval street pattern around St. Paul's Cathedral, was watched from high points across the city by civilians who described it in terms that were simultaneously horrified and transfixed. The burning city producing a visual experience that no wartime vocabulary had yet found quite the right words. Fact number 65. The system of coded public warnings used alongside the main siren alert was more complex than is generally remembered, and required civilians to have internalized a set of acoustic distinctions that had to be recalled correctly under conditions of color. Stress. The main warning siren, the rising and falling wail, was distinct from the all clear, but in some areas, additional signals were used to indicate different types of threat. Yellow warnings indicated that an attack was imminent, but not yet local. Red warnings indicated immediate danger. Purple warnings, used in some areas, indicated a threat to specific industrial targets. The addition of multiple coded signals to the siren system reflected the Civil Defense Authority's recognition that a single binary warning, danger or not danger, was insufficient for a population managing a range of different threats over a million warfare. Sustained period. The cognitive load placed on civilians to maintain this system accurately in memory, to respond correctly when stress and sleep deprivation were chronic features of daily life, was considered by some wartime psychologists to be underestimated in the official assumptions about civilian performance under the alert system, and the simplification of the warning protocols in later years reflected a practical acknowledgement that the complexity of the original system exceeded what could reliably be maintained by a population that had been running on insufficient sleep for months. Fact number 6. The relationship between the blackout and the experience of natural darkness, mist, fog, moonless nights, created conditions in some urban areas that were described as approaching absolute darkness, in which movement without assistance became genuinely dangerous. London fogs during the blackout were among the most disorientating conditions of the civilian war. The combination of the natural fog and the enforced darkness produced an environment in which visibility was reduced to a few feet in any direction. Sounds were muffled and directionally unreliable, and the landmarks of the street were entirely invisible. People described moving through blackout fog by trailing one hand along walls, testing the edge of each curb with a foot before stepping, and calling ahead to check for obstacles or other pedestrians. Some simply stayed where they were until the fog lifted, or until someone with better local knowledge offered to guide them. The fog that had been one of London's defining atmospheric characteristics in peacetime, the source of aesthetic representations from Dickens to Whistler, became in the blackout years something experienced primarily as a practical problem, a navigation hazard layered on top of an already complete darkness. The city's characteristic weather collaborating with its wartime conditions to create something that the city's famous weather had not quite produced in this specific combination before. Fact number 67. The documentation of bomb damage in British cities was conducted systematically during the war by the Bomb Census Organisation, which recorded the location, type, and effects of every bomb that fell on Britain. The result was an archive of extraordinary detail, maps marked with the positions of thousands of individual bomb strikes, records of damage type and extent, casualty figures correlated with shelter use and building type, analysis of patterns in the bombing that could be used to improve civil defense response. The organization employed cartographers, statisticians, and surveyors who worked from reports submitted by wardens and civil defense services, compiling information into a national picture of the bombing that no individual could have assembled from their own experience. The bomb census data has been extensively used by historians and remains one of the most detailed records of the effects of aerial bombing on a civilian population that exists from the period. What it does not capture, and cannot capture, is the individual experience of the dots on its maps. The specific night, the specific family, the specific moment when the dot was made and the house it marks ceased to be a home. The census recorded what happened to the city. The diaries and letters of the people inside the dots recorded what it felt like from inside, and the two records together, held in tension, are as close as the historical record comes to the full experience. Fact number 68. The return of evacuated children to bombed cities created a specific set of adjustment difficulties that were documented by teachers and social workers in the later years of the war. Children who had spent 2 or 3 years in rural areas, away from both bombing and their families, returned to urban environments that had been significantly physically altered by raids and that were socially different from the cities they had left. Streets were missing buildings. Neighborhoods had changed character. Friends from before the evacuation had sometimes not returned or were in different places. The social geography of childhood, the known routes, the familiar faces, the established games and territories had to be rebuilt from scratch in an environment that bore only partial resemblance to the one that had been left. Children who returned also had to reintegrate into family lives that had reorganized themselves around their absence. Younger siblings had arrived, parents had adapted to different routines. The household had closed around the gap the evacuee had left and was now required to open again. The adjustments required of returned evacuees were, in most cases, made. Children are generally more adaptable than adults in their recovery from displacement, but they were made with a cost in uncertainty and effort that the official framework for managing evacuation return had not particularly prepared for. Fact number 69. The specific experience of being bombed out, losing a home to direct bombing, was common enough in British cities to generate its own administrative and social infrastructure. Rest centres, usually schools or church halls, were designated to receive bombed-out families in the immediate aftermath of a raid, providing temporary shelter, hot food, and assistance with the bureaucratic processes of registering damage and accessing emergency support. The quality of rest centres varied enormously, from well-organised facilities with adequate provision to overwhelmed buildings with insufficient food and bedding. And the variability was a persistent source of public complaint that the government took seriously enough to undertake surveys of rest centre conditions and to issue improved standards of provision. Families who had been bombed out described the experience of arriving at a rest centre with whatever they had been able to carry from their house as a specific threshold moment in the experience of the war, the point at which the abstract possibility of losing everything had become an actual fact, and the immediate question was not how to prevent it, but how to proceed from it. The practical capability with which the rest centre met that question, whether there was hot tea, whether there was a bed, whether someone took down the details with competence and human warmth, determined whether the first hours after the loss were manageable or overwhelming. Fact number 7. 0. The specific challenge of maintaining children's education during the bombing years produced a range of responses, from complete school closure to continued operation under raid conditions that varied by area, by school, and by the individual decisions of head teachers, who were sometimes left to make policy in the absence of clear central guidance. Schools that continued operating through the Blitz developed raid routines, the immediate movement of children to shelter positions on the siren, the continuation of lessons in basement or reinforced areas. The management of children's anxiety during raids through the combination of distraction, calm teacher presence, and the reassurance of continued routine. Some teachers described the specific technique of maintaining a lesson, keeping a voice steady and a topic going, while bombs fell close enough to be felt in the floor, as one of the more demanding forms of professional performance they had ever been asked to deliver. The children for whom this was done, who were in a classroom doing arithmetic or reciting poetry while the building shook around them, received from that performance a message that was more important than any arithmetic or poetry. That normal things could continue, that the adults in charge were not frightened, that the structure of ordinary life was sufficient to contain what was happening outside it. Whether this was strictly true was a separate question. As a message delivered to a child. Fact number 71. The experience of fire watching at industrial sites and large commercial buildings during the war fell to employees and managers who organized their own rooftop watch arrangements, in addition to whatever civil defense provision existed. Factory fire watch teams worked in rotation, covering the building through the hours of darkness, with a combination of vigilance, boredom, and the specific alertness that a siren or the sound of aircraft could produce in a person who had been sitting quietly in the dark for 2 hours. The rooftop environment of an industrial building at night during a raid was qualitatively different from the street below, more exposed to blast, more directly in the path of falling incendiaries, more removed from the assistance of neighbours and wardens who might respond to a shout from ground level. Factory fire watchers who extinguished incendiaries on rooftops did so in conditions of genuine personal danger, in the dark, often alone or in pairs, with equipment they had practiced using, but that they had not, until the war, used in anger. The contribution of industrial firewatching to the preservation of Britain's manufacturing capacity during the Blitz has been calculated by historians as significant. The factories that kept burning were frequently those whose rooftop watch had been inadequate, while those that survived raids intact were often those whose firewatch teams had responded to incendiaries in the first minutes before fires. Fact number 7. 2. The German bombing of British cities eventually shifted its primary target from London to provincial cities, and then to the industrial centres of the Midlands and North, in a pattern that reflected both strategic intent and a practical calculation. Of which targets offered the greatest return on the cost of the raid. Birmingham, Coventry, Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol and Plymouth all received attacks of significant severity between 1940 and 1941, each with its own civilian experience of the raid, the damage and the aftermath. The experience of the provincial Blitz differed from the London experience in ways that reflected the size and structure of the cities involved. Smaller cities had less dispersed damage patterns, which meant that proportionally more of the civilian population was directly affected by individual raids. Liverpool, as Britain's primary western port, was bombed with a sustained intensity over several weeks in May 1941 that was comparable to the worst of the London raids. The city sustained damage across virtually every neighbourhood, and the civilian infrastructure, the rest centres, the warden networks, the rescue services, was tested to its limits in a sequence of nights that revealed both the resilience that the system had built and the gaps that remained in it when the volume of damage exceeded what the planning assumptions had anticipated. Fact number 73. The psychological legacy of the bombing years for those who survived them extended well beyond the end of the war, in ways that the medical and psychological establishment of the period was poorly equipped to recognize or address. Veterans of the civilian bombing experience, who developed what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, presented to doctors in the post-war years with symptoms attributed to other causes: nerves, exhaustion, constitutional weakness, because the framework for understanding the psychological effects of sustained civilian trauma did not yet exist in any accessible clinical form. People who startled at loud sounds, who could not sleep in dark enclosed spaces, who experienced intrusive memories of raid nights triggered by specific sounds or smells, were told that their difficulty was personal rather than produced, that it reflected something about their individual makeup rather than something that any person who had experienced the same thing might reasonably carry. The advice they received was generally to put it behind them and get on, which was the advice the culture as a whole was giving itself about the war, and which was simultaneously the best available option and a comprehensive failure to acknowledge what the bombing years had actually done to the bodies and nervous systems of the people who had been inside them. Fact number 7. The repair and rebuilding of bombed properties during the war was managed by a government scheme that prioritized repair over replacement, patching damaged buildings to make them habitable rather than clearing and rebuilding, which would have consumed materials needed for the war effort. The result was a landscape of repaired buildings that bore the visible marks of their damage: new brick in old walls, replaced windows in frames that showed the ghost of blast damage, roof lines reconstructed in slightly different profiles from the originals. The aesthetic of wartime repair became, in some neighborhoods, a de facto vernacular, a building language of patches and substitutions that recorded, in its materials, the specific events of specific nights without anyone deliberately intending it as commemoration. Walking through a wartime repaired street was reading a text written in brick and timber and glass that recorded raids in the way that a language records experience, imperfectly, partially, with the specific distortions of a record made under pressure by whoever was available at the time, but legibly enough that a careful reader could reconstruct from the materials something of what had happened and when. Fact number 75. The blackouts' effect on the natural world in and around British cities was noted by naturalists during the war years, with a combination of scientific interest and something that reads, in their accounts, as genuine pleasure. The reduction in artificial light allowed species whose behavior was sensitive to light pollution to extend their range into areas from which they had been absent or rare. Owls were heard in parts of cities where they had not been recorded for decades. Bats increased in urban populations that the previous level of artificial light had suppressed. The dawn chorus in the period just before first light, when the birds began their territorial and communicative singing, was described by those who were awake at that hour, which during the blackout included a significant number of people who had been up all night, as remarkably rich in both volume and variety compared to what had been audible before the war. The darkness that had been imposed on the city to prevent bombers from navigating by its light had, as a consequence that its designers had not considered, returned to the city a version of its natural acoustic and ecological character that peacetime lighting had been systematically suppressing for decades. The bombers were trying to find the city in the dark. The owls had simply been waiting for the lights to go out. Fact number 76. The experience of the night shift worker during the blackout years combined the disorientation of working in darkness with the specific difficulty of commuting through bombed streets in the hours when raids were most likely to occur. Factory workers on night shifts in munitions and manufacturing plants that could not be closed because their production was essential left home in the early evening and returned in the early morning, often exactly the hours during which raids were most frequent and most intense. The management of this commute became a daily risk calculation that most workers did not experience as exceptional because it was simply the condition of getting to work. And getting to work was not a voluntary choice in most wartime factories. Transport services ran reduced but maintained. Buses diverted around bomb damage. Trains delayed by track clearance. But operating. And the workers who used them did so with the pragmatic acceptance that had become the characteristic civilian response to the war's daily impositions. Some described the early morning commute home through streets showing fresh damage from the previous night's raid as one of the more consistently memorable experiences of the war years, the specific quality of dawn light on new rubble. The smell of smoke that was still warm, the strange quiet that followed a night of noise, the city in the first minutes of assessing what it had lost and deciding whether to go on. Fact number 7. The use of humor in blackout and raid conditions extended to the professional entertainment world through a specific wartime institution. The concert party and the variety performance, mounted in shelters, rest centers, and public spaces during and immediately after raids. INSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association, organized performances for both military and civilian audiences throughout the war, but parallel to the official provision. Informal entertainment, organized by civilians themselves, appeared spontaneously in the larger shelters and became part of the established culture of those spaces. Singers who had been professional performers before the war gathered people around them on tube platforms and led sing-alongs. Comedians who had been performing in music halls adapted their material to the specific circumstances. Jokes about the blackout, about ration books, about wardens and sirens, and the particular inconveniences of shelter life, and found that audiences who were living inside these experiences responded to humor about them with an intensity that was different from the ordinary laughter of entertainment. The audience laughed because they recognized, and because recognition was a form of community, and because community in a shelter during a raid was the most essential possible thing. The confirmation that the people around you had been through what you had been through and were still capable of finding it funny. Fact number 7. 8. The specific administrative challenge of managing the blackout across the full range of building types in a British city, from terraced houses to factory complexes to hospitals to hotels, required a degree of coordination between the civil defense, authority and property managers that was documented in detail in the correspondence files of local wardens' posts. Hospitals that needed lighting at night for medical work operated under special dispensation that required their windows to be blacked out to a standard that allowed interior work while preventing light from escaping. Factory complexes with multiple large windows and skylights required industrial-scale blackout solutions, heavy curtain systems on tracks, painted glass. In some cases, the complete removal of glazing and its replacement with blackout boarding that remained in place for the duration. Hotels that continued to operate for guests, primarily those housing government staff, essential workers, and transit military personnel, managed their public spaces with a combination of blackout curtaining on public windows and strictly enforced protocols for guests in rooms. The cumulative labor required to maintain all of this blackout provision across a major city, night after night for years, without failure, represents one of the larger, invisible organizational achievements of the civilian war, a vast distributed operation sustained by the combined effort of millions of individual households. Fact number 7. The morning light that followed a raid, the specific quality of early dawn arriving over a city that had been bombed overnight, was described in consistent terms across accounts from different cities and different years, in ways that suggest it was a genuinely distinctive visual experience. The dust that bombing generated was still settling in the first light, producing a specific diffusion of early morning sunlight that softened the outlines of damage and created a visual atmosphere that survivors described as both beautiful and deeply wrong. The beauty of light in dust, sitting in direct contradiction to what the dust was and where it had come from. Photographers who documented the aftermath of raids produced images in which this quality of light is visible, the soft, particle-diffused early morning that makes debris look almost peaceful, that invests ruins with a stillness which the night's noise had not prepared anyone to find. The contradiction between the visual register and the experiential one, between how the morning after a raid could look and what it actually was one of the more persistent and difficult features of the civilian bombing experience. The senses occasionally producing something close to beauty in conditions that had no business being beautiful, and the mind required to hold both responses simultaneously without resolving the tension between them into something simpler than it actually was. Fact number 80. The civil defense training films produced during the war represent one of the more unusual bodies of film that the period generated. Instructional documentaries designed to teach specific civilian survival behaviors that were simultaneously propaganda, public information, and genuinely useful technical instruction. Films covering what to do in a gas attack, how to use a stirrup pump on an incendiary fire, how to treat blast injuries in the absence of medical assistance, and how to manage shelter conditions during a prolonged raid were produced with the dual aim of conveying accurate information and of conveying it in a tone that was calm and matter-of-fact enough to be absorbed by an audience for whom the subject matter was already a source of considerable anxiety. The balance between sufficient gravity to take the subject seriously and sufficient calm to avoid amplifying fear was managed with variable success. Some films achieved it and some did not, but the overall body of civil defense film from the period represents a specific attempt to use cinema as a practical tool for civilian survival instruction. And the films that succeeded did so because they treated their audience as capable of receiving accurate and difficult information in a form that assumed competence rather than fragility, which is, it turns out, one of the more reliable ways to produce the competence you were assuming. Fact number 81. The experience of sheltering in public deep shelters alongside several thousand strangers for multiple consecutive nights produced social dynamics that were observed and recorded by social researchers, civil defense staff, and ordinary civilians in ways that constitute a reasonably comprehensive account of what sustained enforced proximity does to human social behavior. The first night in a new shelter was described as the most difficult. The strangeness of the space, the unknown faces, the uncertainty about where one could legitimately be, and how the space was organized. By the third or fourth night, a degree of social mapping had occurred. People knew who their immediate neighbors were, had made the small territorial arrangements that define a temporary shared space, and had begun the exchange of information about themselves that constitutes the beginning of community. By the second week, the shelter had its regulars and its social geography, the noisy end and the quiet end, the area where children played, the corner where the older men played cards, the section of platform that was understood to be for families with young children. This social geography was entirely self-generated, maintained entirely through social expectation, and was treated with sufficient seriousness by its participants to constitute a real, if temporary, set of norms. The civil defense authorities, who eventually formalized some of these arrangements, were, in most cases, fact number 82. The Blackouts' effect on shopkeeping and retail commerce required a specific set of adaptations that affected both the physical design of shops and the behavior of shoppers in ways that have been almost entirely forgotten. Shops that could previously rely on window displays to attract customers and communicate availability found that the blackout eliminated the window display entirely. A darkened shop window, showing nothing, was indistinguishable from a closed one. Shopkeepers adapted by moving communication to other channels, handwritten boards placed in doorways, word of mouth through the network of regular customers. The particular telephone calls between neighbors that constituted the informal intelligence system of wartime retail. Customers who normally browsed by window could no longer do so, and the process of shopping became more purposeful and more dependent on prior knowledge. You went to a shop because you had been told it had what you needed, not because the window had caught your attention. The retail relationship between shop and customer, which had been built partly on visibility and partly on the serendipitous encounter of customer with displayed goods, was reorganized around information networks that had nothing visual about them, and that proved, in some respects, more efficient than the system they replaced, though they required a social infrastructure of shared information that was possible only in communities. Fact number 83. The specific experience of Londoners during the period of the V weapons in 1944 and 1945 was in some ways more psychologically challenging than the earlier Blitz, despite the smaller scale of casualties. Because it came after a period of relative quiet, and after the civilian population had begun to believe that the worst was behind them. The V1 campaign that began in June 1944 arrived when morale had been relatively high following the D-Day landings, and its psychological effect was disproportionate to its physical impact, in part because of that timing. The sense that a danger that had seemed to be receding had returned in a new form, with new characteristics that the experienced raid behaviors of the Blitz did not fully apply to. The V-2 was worse in this respect. The absence of warning, the impossibility of response, the sheer randomness of who happened to be in the wrong place at the moment of impact, produced an anxiety that was qualitatively different from the anxiety of the Blitz. Because it had no behavioral component, you could do nothing. There was nothing to prepare, nothing to listen for, no shelter procedure that changed the outcome. The acceptance of pure, unmanageable randomness, the psychological adjustment to a danger in which behavior is entirely irrelevant to survival, was the final lesson of the bombing years. And it was delivered after people had spent 4 years being told and believing that what they did made a difference. Fact number 8. The collection and preservation of personal accounts from the bombing years was undertaken by several organizations during the war itself, with the explicit recognition that the testimony of ordinary civilians about their experiences was historically significant and should be gathered while it was fresh. The Mass Observation Project, begun in 1937, expanded its activities during the Blitz to document civilian attitudes, behaviors, and experiences with a systematic attention to the ordinary and the everyday that distinguished it from the official propaganda record. Mass observation volunteers kept diaries, conducted street interviews, and submitted reports on what they observed in their own communities during and after raids. The archive they generated, now held at the University of Sussex, constitutes one of the most detailed records of British civilian life during the war that exists, capturing dimensions of daily experience that official records did not reach. Reading mass observation accounts of the Blitz is a different experience from reading official civil defense reports of the same events, the same nights, the same streets, seen from the inside and from the outside simultaneously. That the experience of the thing and the management of the thing placed in juxtaposition in a way that neither record alone could produce. The people who kept those diaries and made those observations preserved something that would otherwise have been entirely lost to the gap. Fact number 85. The specific sounds associated with the V1 flying bomb became so deeply embedded in the memory of people who heard them that documented cases of involuntary auditory recall, people hearing sounds decades later that triggered the physical fear, response associated with the doodlebug's engine cutting out, appeared in the medical literature of the post-war decades. The pulse jet engine sound of the V1 was distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable, a rapid buzzing that contemporary accounts compared to a badly tuned motorcycle engine, and the behavioral condition response it had established. The association between that specific sound and the requirement for immediate physical action was reinforced by weeks and months of raids to a degree that the nervous system retained it long after the V1 campaign had ended. Former Londoners describing this experience decades later noted the specific disorientation of the involuntary response, the body beginning to respond to the remembered for it before the conscious mind had confirmed that what was being heard was not the original sound. The conditioned fear response to the V1 is one of the cleaner examples in the historical record of wartime civilian trauma operating as a genuine physiological phenomenon, rather than a matter of emotional weakness or insufficient recovery. The body had learned something during the summer of 1944, and, being a body rather than a mind, had not found it straightforward. Fact number 86. The Blackouts' contribution to the war effort was subject to ongoing debate among strategists about its actual effectiveness in preventing German bombers from navigating to their targets. German aircraft used a system of radio navigation beams, the Kickbane, and later the X-Ray system, that allowed them to navigate to target areas independently of visual ground reference, which meant that the Blackouts' primary intended function, preventing visual navigation, was less effective against equipped aircraft than it would have been against crews relying on visual reference. The Blackout was more effective against individual aircraft that had become separated from their formation and lost their radio navigation signal, and against crews bombing through clouds who were estimating their position from whatever ground reference they could obtain. against a well-organized, well-equipped raid, following established radio beams. The blackout offered relatively limited protection compared to the cost and inconvenience it imposed on the civilian population. This assessment was available to the British authorities during the war and did not result in the abandonment of the blackout, partly because even partial protection had value. Partly because the psychological and moral effects of the blackout on the civilian population were understood to be as important as its military effects, and partly because maintaining the blackout was one of the forms of participation. Fact number 87. The specific experience of giving birth in a shelter or bomb-damaged hospital during the war years was documented by midwives and nurses with a practical matter-of-factness that reflected both professional training and the wartime disposition toward managing extraordinary circumstances with ordinary competence. Births occurred in Anderson shelters, in underground stations, in hospital basements lit by emergency generators, and in the back rooms of houses whose front walls had been removed by blast. Midwives called to deliveries during raids navigated bombed streets in the dark, carrying their equipment in bags they had learned to pack for every contingency that working in a city under attack might require. Some births were attended by whoever was present, rather than by medical professionals. Wardens, neighbors, shelter occupants who had no training and who managed by following instructions called through from someone who had. The children born under these conditions were delivered into the world in circumstances that their parents could describe in detail for the rest of their lives. The specific raid, the specific shelter, the specific quality of light and sound that attended their arrival, the bomb that fell during labor or immediately after, the extraordinary normality of a new person appearing in the middle of everything. New life in the middle of a bombing raid is the most straightforward and most complete expression of everything the civilian war was. Ordinary life continuing, insisting on itself, arriving exactly as scheduled, regardless of what else was happening overhead. Fact number 88. The gardens in which Anderson shelters sat were transformed by the war in ways that extended beyond the shelter itself. The shelter's earth covering became, as already noted, a site for growing vegetables. But the wider management of the garden, the decision about what to grow, how to maintain it, what to prioritize, reflected the same reorganization of domestic priorities that affected everything else about civilian life. During the war, lawns were dug up for vegetables. Flower beds were converted. The aesthetic of the peacetime suburban garden, its emphasis on ornament, on color, on the pleasures of a space that was not productive, gave way to the wartime garden's emphasis on yield. Some gardeners mourned the flowers. Others discovered in the vegetable garden a satisfaction that the flower garden had not provided, the satisfaction of production, of a growing thing that could be eaten, of a direct and measurable contribution to the household's food supply that felt, in the context of everything else the war required, less like a hobby and more like the most natural possible response to the times. The Anderson shelter sat at the center of this transformed space, simultaneously the most functional and the least beautiful thing in a garden that had become, of necessity, significantly more functional and somewhat less beautiful than it had been before the war made function the primary available virtue. Fact number 89. The experience of the first night of the blackout, September 1st, 1939, 2 days before the formal declaration of war, was recorded by diarists across Britain with a mixture of anticipation, strangeness, and a specific quality of collective unreality. Streets that had been lit the previous night went dark simultaneously in a planned and coordinated way that had no precedent in living memory. People who walked outside on that first blackout night described a city made suddenly unfamiliar by the removal of its light. The same streets, the same buildings, the same distances, but without the visual information that had made navigation unconscious and familiar. Some described it as exciting. Some described it as frightening. Many described it as strange, in a way they found difficult to articulate. A sensation of the known world having stepped slightly sideways while maintaining all its other characteristics. The first blackout night was not accompanied by bombing. The feared immediate aerial assault on British cities did not materialize in the first weeks of the war, which meant that the darkness was experienced initially as preparatory rather than responsive, as a thing done in anticipation of something that had not yet happened. The strangeness of living in the dark for something that might come was, in its own way, a form of experience that no previous war had required of urban civilian populations in quite this way. The reorganization of daily life, not in response to a present danger, but in expectation of a future one. Fact number 90. The experience of the blackout in rural areas was different in kind from the urban experience, in ways that reflected the different baseline conditions of rural and urban darkness. In cities, the blackout represented a radical departure from a highly artificial light environment that had not existed a century earlier. In the countryside, genuine darkness at night was familiar. The rural night had always been dark, in the way the city was now being forced to be. Farmers and rural workers who had always navigated by natural light, by starlight, by the particular darkness that comes when the moon is behind clouds, found the blackout regulations largely confirmatory of conditions they already operated in. The absence of the blackout regulations, for many rural communities, would not have changed their night much. What the regulations added to rural life was not a change in light conditions, but the administrative apparatus of enforcement, wardens in villages, prosecution of light showing, the extension of urban civil defense bureaucracy into communities that had been managing their own darkness since before electricity arrived. The rural experience of the blackout is a reminder that what was extraordinary about the urban blackout was not the darkness itself. The dark has always been there, but the removal of the light that human beings had placed between themselves and it, and the consequent revelation that the dark was still exactly where it had always been. Fact number 91. The specific social phenomenon of the shelter concert. The impromptu musical performance organized by civilians in underground stations and public shelters during the Blitz was documented in enough detail to constitute a recognizable institution of the civilian war. The performances ranged from solo singing to fully organized entertainment programs, from classical music played on a portable instrument to Cockney sing-alongs in which the entire platform joined in. The sing-along format, a communal rather than a performed experience, in which the audience was also the performer, was perhaps the most common and the most effective form, because it required nothing except voices and to sing in public. People who would never have sung in any other context found that they sang in the shelter, that the combination of group and darkness and the specific social permissions of emergency had removed the usual obstacles. The songs chosen reflected the social and emotional content of the moment. Patriotic songs, music hall standards, ballads that acknowledged loss and distance, comic songs that redirected anxiety into laughter. The singing was, in the most literal sense, how people in shelters produced and maintained community. The collective voice as the most immediate available expression of the fact that these were people, together, in the dark, still here, still capable of making something that sounded like this. Fact number 92. The period between the end of the original Blitz in May 1941 and the beginning of the V-weapon attacks in June 1944 was not free of aerial threat, but represented a significant reduction in the intensity of bombing over Britain. And the civilian adaptation to this reduction was its own psychological process. People who had spent months sleeping in shelters and organizing their lives around the raid routine found that the reduction in raids did not simply reverse the habit the raids had installed. Some continued, going to shelters when warnings sounded well after the probability of a significant raid had receded. Others found that sleeping in their own beds felt, for a period, less secure than sleeping in the shelter. The body had learned the shelter as the safe location and needed time to transfer that association back to the bedroom. The restoration of normal sleeping arrangements, the gradual reduction in the nightly alert state, the return of undisrupted nights. These changes were welcomed, but required their own adjustment. The civilian body and mind that had adapted to sustained threat did not immediately recognize the removal of the threat as an invitation to relax. The habits of vigilance that had been installed were not dissolved by the absence of the stimulus that had created them. They faded, slowly and unevenly, at the body's own pace, not at the pace that peace had returned. Fact number 93. The specific experience of children who were neither evacuated nor sent to shelter during raids, who remained in the house, under the stairs or in the Morrison shelter, was documented in accounts that reveal the particular relationship that domestic space created with the experience of bombing. Children who sheltered under stairs or in internal Morrison shelters experienced the raid through the fabric of their own house, the shaking of the floor, the rattling of the windows, the sounds of objects falling in other rooms, the particular quality of a house absorbing blast at close range. The home that was supposed to be the safest place was also the thing that might collapse, and the child's relationship with the familiar space of their own house was permanently altered by the experience of feeling it respond to explosions. Some children described years later a lasting attention to the structural sounds of buildings, creaks, shifts, the particular acoustic of a space under stress, that they traced directly to the experience of lying in a Morrison shelter, listening to their house during a raid. The Morrison was inside the house, and therefore enclosed by it, which was both its protection and its particular vulnerability. Unlike the Anderson and the garden, the Morrison sheltered you inside the thing that was being threatened, which was a different psychological relationship with danger than outside protection provided. Fact number 94. The documentation of the blackout and raid experience by ordinary British civilians through the mass observation diaries and other personal records reveals a consistent and sometimes surprising feature of daily emotional life during the bombing. Period. The coexistence of acute fear with equally acute ordinariness. Diary entries from the height of the Blitz contain descriptions of raids that are followed immediately by descriptions of what was had for supper, what was on the radio, what a neighbor said about the new ration regulations. Crowds gathered in Piccadilly Circus when the illuminated signs were turned on for the first time. Children who had never seen the city lit at night stood in streets that their parents were seeing for the first time in 5 years and watched the light with an attention that the always lit world would never have produced. The restoration of light after years of enforced darkness was experienced as something more than the end of a precautionary measure. It was experienced as the return of a version of the world that had existed before the war and that had been one of the things, among many, that the war had taken. Light in a window at night, a lit sign above a shop, a street lamp casting its pall on a wet pavement. These were ordinary things that years of their absence had made significant, and the significance was felt bodily and completely by the people who stood in those restored pools of light and understood, for the first time in a long time, that the war was actually over. Fact number 96. The legacy of the blackout years in British culture extended beyond direct memory into the fabric of buildings, streets, and the physical infrastructure of cities, in ways that continued to be visible for decades. Anderson shelters remained in gardens long after the war, rusting, overgrown, occasionally still containing the objects left in them when the all clear sounded for the last time. Bomb sites in city centres remained undeveloped for years, converted to informal car parks, or simply left as open ground, where fireweed and rosebay willowherb colonized the rubble with a persistence that made them, in some neighborhoods, the first new growth that had appeared on those sites in centuries. The physical scars of the bombing were absorbed into the urban landscape gradually, unevenly, according to the availability of resources and the priorities of successive administrations, so that for decades after the war ended, the evidence of it remained visible in the fabric of British cities to anyone who knew how to read it. The ghost of a bombed terrace, visible in an irregular gap in a street, the slightly different brick of a rebuilt section of wall, the low, temporary-looking post-war buildings that had stood for 30 years in spaces where the permanent buildings had been. The city read its own history in these marks, slowly and without commentary, in the long, quiet years after the noise had stopped. Fact number 9. The decision to maintain normal civic life, the opening of museums, galleries, libraries, and entertainment venues during the bombing, was made at a policy level, but was sustained by the individual decisions of the people who ran those institutions to remain at their posts through raids. Museum curators, who had moved the most valuable collections to country houses and deep shelters for safekeeping, continued to work in depleted buildings whose remaining contents they protected through the raids. The National Gallery, as has been noted, hosted concerts in rooms stripped of paintings. The British Museum remained open in a building that had been damaged by bombing. The decision to keep these institutions functioning was understood by the people who made it as a statement about what civilization consists of and what defending it actually requires. Not only the military defense of territorial integrity, but the maintenance of the practices and places that give territorial integrity its meaning. That the statement was also true, that people did go to the National Gallery for concerts, and did borrow books from damaged libraries, and did continue to feel that these things mattered and were worth the effort of providing, is the part of the story that makes it more than symbolic. Fact number 9. The specific memory of the blackout, as it persisted in the decades after the war, had a particular character among those who had been children during it, a mixture of recalled fear and recalled intensity that the peacetime world had not matched. People who had been children in bombed cities described the war years with a vividness of detail that stood out against their memories of peacetime. The colors, sounds, smells, and textures of the blackout period were recalled with a precision that their memories of the less eventful years before and after did not consistently match. Psychologists who have studied autobiographical memory in survivors of the civilian bombing have noted that the heightened emotional intensity of the raid period appears to have created stronger memory encoding than was typical for the same Cold War individuals under normal conditions. The body's alert state during raids, its elevated hormonal engagement with the threat, produced a more complete and more durable recording of experience than ordinary daily life provided. This is one of the reasons why the testimony of those who were children during the Blitz is often so specific and so consistent. The memories were laid down under conditions that made them stick in ways that the less eventful days around them did not. The blackout years remembered themselves into the people who lived through them in ways that the years on either side of them generally did not. Fact number 99. The end of the V2 campaign in March 1945, when the last rocket fell on Britain, was not marked by any public announcement or ceremony. The government had never officially acknowledged that the explosions were caused by rockets rather than conventional bombs, having suppressed the information for as long as it was strategically useful. The last V2 fell on a road in Orpington, in Kent, on March 27, 1945, killing 1 person and injuring 23. No one knew at the time that it was the last. There was nothing about it to distinguish it from the ones before it, and the absence of further attacks revealed its finality only in retrospect. The people who lived through the V-weapon period and who survived it moved on from it in the same practical way that they had moved on from every other phase of the bombing, by continuing with what needed to be done, by not dwelling, by maintaining the forward orientation that 5 years of civilian war had installed as the defining disposition of survival. The last bomb fell. Nobody announced it. The silence that followed was indistinguishable, at first, from the silence between raids. It was only when the silence continued, day after day, that it became possible to believe that this time it might mean something different, that the waiting, which had been the texture of 5 years of civilian life, might finally, this time, actually be over. Fact number 100. The generation that grew up in the blackout years carried its specific childhood experiences forward into a post-war world that had no equivalent reference point for most of what they had lived through. Children who had navigated bombed streets, slept in shelters, collected shrapnel, and listened for the particular sound of a V1 engine cutting out, grew into adults whose relationship with physical security and material comfort was shaped by having experienced their systematic removal and gradual return. They tended, as a generation, to find ordinary domestic comfort more actively pleasurable than those who had not experienced its absence. The warm room, the lit window, the full table, the undisturbed night, with things they had been without for long enough to know their value, and to receive their return with something closer to gratitude than the merely comfortable typically feel. They also tended, as a generation, toward a particular practical competence with limited resources, the ability to manage on less, to improvise, to find alternative approaches when the expected one was unavailable, that the war had installed in them at an age when such capacities, once acquired, tend to last. The blackout years were over. What they had made of the people who lived through them was not over, and remained present in those people for the rest of their lives, carried forward in their habits and their pleasures and their specific, well-earned relationship with ordinary things, or sign moderate by all of red or red. Fact number 101. What the blackout years ultimately demonstrate, across every city, every country, every category of civilian experience, from the fire watcher on a rooftop to the child asleep in a Morrison shelter, is the same thing that the civilian experience of the war demonstrates, wherever you look at it closely enough. Human beings adapt. They adapt to darkness. They adapt to noise. They adapt to the loss of familiar things and the imposition of unfamiliar requirements. They build community in shelters and humor in ruins and concerts in empty galleries. They make soup for strangers and carry messages through bombed streets and keep the train running and deliver the letters to the addresses where the front wall used to be. They do all of this not because they are exceptional, but because they are ordinary. Because ordinary human beings, when the situation requires it of them, turn out to be capable of more than any ordinary situation would have thought to ask. The blackout lasted 5 years and 8 months. The streets went dark, and then, one evening in May 1945, they came back. The people who had lived in the dark between those two dates went home through the lit streets, found their beds, and slept, many of them, for the first time in years, through the entire night without listening for anything. The silence was the sound of it being over, and the light was exactly what it had always been: ordinary, reliable, completely taken for granted, which was precisely what made it, after all that time in the dark, so entirely and completely perfect. There is something that happens when you spend enough time inside the details of the blackout years. The large shapes of the history, the raids, the damage figures, the strategic assessments, begin to recede, and what comes forward instead are the smaller things. The warden paused outside a window to check for the gap in a curtain. The family descends into a cold, damp Anderson shelter with a deck of cards and a candle. The fire watcher on a rooftop, watching a city burn and finding, in spite of everything, that the word that came to mind was spectacle. The child filled a tin with warm shrapnel in the morning, the all clear sounding, and the specific quality of the breath that followed it. The blackout years were, at their most fundamental level, an experiment in what human beings do when the familiar conditions of daily life are removed and replaced with something that requires entirely different skills. The light went out. The streets went dark. The rules that had governed how you moved through the world, look where you were going, follow the road, find the house by the lamppost on the corner, stopped applying. And people adapted. Not all at once, not without difficulty, not without the specific costs that 5 years of disrupted sleep and sustained low-level fear will extract from any body and any mind. But they adapted. They learned to navigate by memory and touch. They learned to read a soundscape that told them things about their immediate safety that no visual information could provide. They learned the social geography of a shelter platform and the acoustic signature of a V1 engine at 3 in the morning. And they carried both kinds of knowledge with the same practical attentiveness that they brought to everything else the war asked of them. What runs through all of these facts, through the fire watches and the shelter concerts and the rescue dogs and the cardboard coffins that were never used and the barrage balloons that glowed blue in electrical storms, is a quality that is easy to name and difficult to fully describe. It is the quality of people continuing, not triumphantly, not without fear, not always with grace, but continuing, day after day, through years of conditions that had no end bait visible from inside them. The fire watcher climbed back onto the rooftop. The postman delivered the letters to the address where the front wall was missing. The orchestra played in the besieged city. The library kept its books circulating through the bombed streets. The kettle went on in the shelter. These are not dramatic acts. They are ordinary acts performed inside extraordinary conditions, and their ordinariness is precisely what makes them worth attending to. Because ordinary acts sustained across years are what constitute a life. And a life sustained through the blackout years was something that cost far more than the word ordinary typically implies. The people who lived through those years came out of them changed, in ways that some found difficult to articulate, and that the world around them was not always patient enough to wait for them to find the words for. They carried the acoustic memory of the all clear. They carried the smell of building dust in a way that could return them, without warning, to a specific night. They carried the habit of listening before sleeping, the instinct, installed by years of waiting for sirens, to give the dark a moment to declare its intentions before allowing themselves to go under. They carried these things forward into a peacetime that had its own demands, and that was not always interested in the specific inheritance of people who had spent years underground. But they also carried something else. They carried the knowledge, not abstract, not theoretical, but bodily and specific, that they had been inside something enormous and had continued, that the darkness had lasted for years and had been ended, that the light had come back exactly as it had always been, ordinary and reliable and entirely taken for granted by anyone who had not been without it. That the ordinary things, the lit street, the undisturbed night, the cup of tea delivered by someone who had driven a van through a bombed city to bring it to you, were not ordinary at all, and that knowing this, really knowing it from the inside, rather than acknowledging it as an idea, was one of the things the blackout years had given to the people who lived through them, in exchange for everything else they had taken. The streets are lit now. They have been lit for 80 years. The darkness that fell on those cities, enforced and collective, and maintained by the vigilance of millions of individual households every night for 5 years and 8 months, is so far in the past that most of the people who lived inside it are gone. What remains is the record they left, the diaries, the photographs, the letters, the oral histories, the facts that have been gathered in this collection, and that together make something that no single fact alone can make. The outline of a world that existed, that was dark and loud and frightened, and also in ways that no one had planned and that the darkness itself seemed to produce. Surprisingly and persistently human. Rest now. The lights are on. The night is quiet. Whatever is waiting for you in the morning can wait a little longer. You are safe and warm, and the dark outside your window is just the dark. The old, ordinary dark that has always been there, patient and harmless, waiting for the morning the way it always has. You must have fallen asleep by now. So rest, and we will meet in the next video.